1st of July, 1824. Near the Hickory Tavern in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, a child named John Jeremiah Garrison came into a cramped farmhouse world that ran on debt, muscle, and whatever the rocky soil would give back. His parents, Isaac and Eliza Garrison, kept a small place between Pattenburg and Little York, close enough to the tavern and the stage road that wagon wheels and iron hooves were part of the daily noise, but far enough out that every extra step on the road cost time they could not spare. The house was plain boards and rough beams with a low ceiling that trapped smoke and the smell of boiled pork. From the beginning, John's life centered on chores and survival, not comfort. Hunterdon County was no frontier, yet it was not gentle. Fields needed clearing before they could be plowed, so Isaac and his sons spent long days digging stones from the earth and rolling them into rough fence lines. John watched his father count coins on the table at night, the small piles never matching the list of names and amounts scratched on a scrap of paper. Isaac took work where he could, hauling, cutting, or mending, and whenever he owed more than he could pay, he sent his boys to work off what he could not settle in cash. For John, that meant extra days on neighboring farms, pushing a hoe through unfamiliar fields under the watch of men who treated another man's son like a hired hand with nothing to say. By the time he was strong enough to lift a feed sack without stumbling, John knew the weight of tools better than the feel of books. The family Bible sat in a place of honor, but his hands stayed on axe handles, shovel shafts, and the worn grip of a butcher knife. Autumn meant slaughter, and he learned early how to pin a squealing hog, how to cut the throat clean so the blood ran into a waiting pan, and how to work the blade along joints without wasting meat. The work left clothes stiff with drying blood and hands that smelled of iron no matter how much lye soap he used. Killing for food never bothered him. It was necessity, and in that house necessity never asked permission. Isaac's temper was quick and visible. When money fell short, his voice rose. When tools went missing or chores lagged, his jaw clenched and his hands tightened. John saw the way his father dealt with neighbors who pressed him for payment. There were no shouted apologies, only a hard stare and an offer of more work. The message passed easily to the sons. If a man pushed, the answer came with effort or with force. John carried that lesson into every field and every borrowed barn. When another boy shoved him away from the water trough, John did not argue. He stepped back once, then drove a fist into the boy's ribs hard enough to fold him over the rail. No sermon followed at home, only a curt warning from Isaac to finish the day's work and keep his fists ready for real trouble, not farmyard squabbles. The tavern gave John his first regular taste of a wider world. Men stepped down from coaches with dust on their coats and coins in their pockets, talking in fast fragments about cities he had never seen and ships larger than any barn in Hunterdon County. He hauled water and chopped wood for the tavern when Isaac sent him, and while he worked, he listened. Sailors who had taken the post road toward New York or Philadelphia talked about distant ports where the air smelled of tar and salt instead of manure. Soldiers passing through described marching columns and cannon fire in places with foreign names. Those scraps of talk stuck with him, carried back to the narrow house that felt smaller every winter. Eliza tried to hold the family together with what little softness she could spare. She patched clothes until the fabric turned to a web of stitches, kept a pot going on the hearth, and coaxed a few flowers to live along the edge of the vegetable patch. She saw what the fields and Isaac's temper were doing to her sons, especially John, who grew broad-shouldered and silent. When he came in from work with knuckles scraped or a shirt cut open across the chest, she washed the skin with cool water and said very little. He rarely explained, and she rarely pressed. In that household, talking did not change anything. Work did. As John grew into his late teens, his size made him useful and dangerous in equal measure. Neighbors wanted him for heavy work, and they paid Isaac for his time. That arrangement kept food in the house, but it also deepened John's sense that he lived as another man's tool. He spent long days swinging a scythe in fields that were not his, or heaving hay bales into lofts owned by men who did not know his full name. At night, when he came back with shoulders burning and hands blistered under fresh callus, Isaac asked how much had been promised, not how the work had gone. Each exchange carved the same thought deeper into John's mind. The farm would never belong to him. The land would never carry his name. News of trouble with Mexico drifted even into Hunterdon County. Newspapers reached the tavern with talk of disputed borders in the Rio Grande, and travelers spoke of volunteers drilling in towns farther south. The United States Navy needed men for its ships, men who could climb rigging, haul lines, and run guns along heaving decks. For someone like John, whose life already revolved around hard labor, the pay and promise of steady food sounded different from another season of stone picking. Recruiting officers did not chase boys into farmhouses. They waited in port cities. John understood that simple fact. If he wanted out, he would have to walk to a place where ships filled the horizon. Leaving home was not marked by ceremony. There was no dramatic argument, no public declaration. One morning before the sky lightened, John gathered the few things that were his alone, wrapped them in a small bundle, and stepped off the familiar yard. Eliza heard the door and met him in the gloom, her face pale in the small spill of firelight from the hearth. She looked at the bundle, then at his shoulders, then placed her hand on his arm for a moment. No words passed that changed anything. Isaac still slept. John crossed the yard, passed the edges of his father's fields, and took the road that led toward bigger towns and deeper water. In the port, the air struck him first. It carried salt, coal smoke, and the sour stink of waste thrown from ships that had just arrived from distant coasts. Masts crowded the harbor line like bare trees. Men shouted orders, cursed in accents he had never heard on the farm, and pushed carts loaded with barrels and crates. At a recruiting table near the waterfront, a Navy officer in a stiff coat asked questions and took names. John gave his birth name, John Jeremiah Garrison, and offered his age in firm words. The officer needed bodies more than birth records. With a few marks on a paper, John's life shifted from fields and tavern yards to a warship that waited at anchor. Shipboard life stripped away any remaining softness. The decks were hard planks that flexed under heavy seas. Hammocks hung in tight rows, close enough that a man could feel another man's breath in the dark. The crew spent every waking hour on routines that never seemed to end. They holystoned the deck on hands and knees, scrubbed ropes with brine, polished brass until their fingers cramped, and drilled on the guns until they could run them out, load, fire, and run them back with mechanical speed. Meals came in rough portions of salted meat, biscuit, and whatever vegetables had not rotted in the hold. Fresh water sat in barrels that went stale and sour between ports. Discipline on the ship ran through fear and habit. Officers carried canes and used them freely across backs and shoulders when orders were slow to be obeyed. The bosun's mates kept a tally of offenses that could end at the mast, where a man's shirt would be stripped from his back and the cat-o'-nine-tails would leave his skin open and wet. Every sailor watched those punishments because looking away was not allowed. John saw lashes bite into flesh until it shone red and raw, saw men carried below with teeth clenched against cries, saw no mercy in the faces of the men giving the orders. The power of rank and the impersonal grind of the Navy pressed against his own rising sense of strength and stubbornness. The war with Mexico took the ship south and kept it there. Cannon drills shifted to live fire when the order came to bring guns to bear on coastal targets. The thump of recoiling carriages, the choking smoke that filled gun decks, and the sharp smell of burned powder marked those days. John's work on the guns was simple and direct. He heaved shot, slammed home rammers, obeyed, shouted commands, and kept moving. Enemy fire rarely reached him directly, but he heard stories of other ships that took hits, of splinters that cut men down as cleanly as bullets, and of sailors buried at sea with a weighted shroud. In the cramped spaces below deck, rumors moved faster than fresh air. For a time, the rigid order of ship life held him. The work was harsh but familiar in its demand for strength. The difference lay in how that strength served men with rank who would never lift a line themselves. John's resentment built in small steps. A shove from an officer's cane when he already had a line at full strain. An accusation of laziness when his hands were bleeding through the callus. A shouted insult that treated him as something less than a man. On the farm, disrespect might end in a fist to the mouth and an understanding reached through pain. On the ship, that response carried punishments he had watched and had no wish to feel on his own back. For months, he swallowed the anger and worked. The breaking point came on a day when the sea lay relatively calm and the crew worked through a long list of maintenance. A petty officer barked orders at a group hauling a heavy line, John among them. The man moved along the line of sailors, striking shoulders with the flat of his hand, then with the handle of a belaying pin when he judged the pull too slow. When he reached John, words passed that no one would repeat the same way later. What mattered was the blow that followed, a sharp, deliberate strike across John's face in front of the other men. The sting of the impact, the hot flood of humiliation, and the sight of grinning faces nearby pulled the last restraint free. John dropped the line, stepped in close, and drove his fist into the officer's jaw with every pound of strength he had built in the fields and on deck. Bone met bone. The officer went down hard, teeth slicing his own lip, blood showing at the corner of his mouth as he sprawled across the planks. Silence on a warship never lasted, but in that instant it felt complete. Then shouts began. Hands grabbed John's arms and wrenched them behind his back. The officer's superior came forward, took one look at the man on the deck, and had John dragged away under guard. Striking an officer was not a small offense. Men had been flogged nearly to death or even hanged for less open defiance. Locked in a cramped space below, wrists raw from rope, John had time to think about the possible end of his story. A farm boy from Hunterdon County could vanish without a trace in the belly of a military prison, and no one at the Hickory Tavern would be told exactly why. Navy regulations favored harsh examples. Flogging would leave scars that never fully healed. Confinement in irons could wreck a man's joints and spirit. In extreme cases, especially during wartime, a sailor who struck an officer might face a noose. The memory of lashes he had seen laid across other men's backs came back to him in sharp flashes. Each image hardened his resolve not to accept the sentence passively. He had run other men's errands his entire life. He had labored under his father's debts, then under officers' commands. Facing the prospect of being broken under their punishment, he decided he would rather vanish and risk the unknown than stand tied to a grating and feel the whip. Opportunity came when the ship made port and routines loosened slightly under the strain of loading and unloading supplies. Guards were still posted, but men moved constantly through the passageways, and confusion always rose when cargo shifted. At some point between the arrival and the next departure, John slipped his restraints or his watch, stepped into the flow of men headed toward the gangway, and reached the edge of the deck. One moment he belonged to the United States Navy as a prisoner awaiting judgment. The next, he moved down the gangplank with other sailors, then cut sideways into a knot of dock workers and disappeared into the press of carts, barrels, and shouting voices. No one grabbed his arm. No officer's voice called his name. He did not look back. Desertion turned him into a hunted man. If the Navy found him, the punishment he had feared would follow with even greater force. That reality shaped his next choice. The name on the ship's roll, John Jeremiah Garrison, now tied directly to a crime the service would not forget. He pushed that name away and took another. Johnson had the sound of something plain and common, a name that would not draw questions when shouted across a camp or carved on a crude mark beside a trail. From that point on, the farm boy from Hickory Tavern stepped into the interior under a different name, carrying the memory of the fist that dropped an officer, and the knowledge that he had already crossed a line that separated ordinary men from those who lived by their own rules. The road ahead ran west, toward a continent of mountains and conflicts that would redefine the scale of violence he had already seen, 1846 to the early 1850s. The streets at the edge of the St. Louis waterfront soaked up every sound that came off the river. Voices from every corner of the country mixed with the calls of deckhands and the clatter of wagon wheels over uneven boards. When John stepped into that noise with a new last name on his tongue, the Navy uniforms were behind him, and the flat farmland of New Jersey might as well have been another world. He walked with the deliberate stride of a man who expected a hand to close on his shoulder at any moment, but nobody on those crowded docks cared what name he had carried on a ship's roll. They cared whether his arms could lift, whether his back could hold out, and whether he would show up for work. He had no papers that tied him officially to anyone. The only things he brought inland were the strength built on farms and decks, a stubborn core that did not bend easily, and a clear sense that he would not let another man own his labor the way the Navy had tried to own his body. A river town ready to push goods and people west offered him exactly what he needed. There were outfits looking for men to cut timber, haul freight and fire boilers. There were steamboat captains who did not ask many questions as long as a man did his part. The Missouri offered a channel that led deep into the interior, and the Missouri demanded fuel at every bend. That simple fact opened a path for a man willing to live hard. He took work first where it appeared, throwing freight on a landing, helping load barrels of flour and whiskey, pushing bales of cloth up narrow ramps into the hungry holds of steamers. The boats that tied up at St. Louis looked tall and fragile at the same time, their decks stacked in layers and their chimneys coughing smoke into the air. Their paddle wheels chewed the river and their boilers burned wood at a rate that stripped the banks of timber. Captains and clerks talked constantly about fuel. The answers came from men who lined the river with stacks of cut cottonwood, selling cords to any steamer that pulled in under their crude landings. Those men were called woodhawks. The name appealed to him because it spoke of work that did not answer to an officer's whistle. Upstream, away from the noise of St. Louis and the easy reach of city law, the woodhawks ran their own small domains. They lived in rough cabins or dugouts above the flood line, kept a few mules or oxen to drag logs, and watched the channel for smoke that marked another boat. A steamer might burn 24 cords or more in a single day. A crew that failed to keep the stacks high could find its boat drifting helplessly with cold boilers. So wood stood between life and death, profit and loss. That dependence meant a man in the cordwood trade had leverage as long as he could defend his stacks. It also meant he sat in one place, exposed, while groups who resented the loss of timber and the spread of traffic studied him from the bluffs. Johnson understood that risk and still stepped into the work. The first days in a wood camp along the Missouri cut new marks into his hands. Cottonwood trunks fell with a hollow thud that echoed in the river breaks. The trees did not split cleanly. He swung a heavy axe until his shoulders burned, then drove wedges into the grain and hit them with a sledge until the sections broke. Each length had to be cut, split, and stacked tightly so the pile would hold when a steamer crew hauled it away. The work never ended. When he looked up from a pile of fresh split logs, the river slid past, brown and restless, tugging at the banks. On some reaches there were no other fires visible, no other cabins. The only sounds were the chop of steel into wood, the cry of birds along the bluffs, and the wind moving through the scattered trees that remained. Nights on the Missouri shore introduced him to a different kind of silence than the one below decks on a warship. The ship had been crowded, full of breath and whispered talk, even when hammocks barely moved. The riverbank camp held stretches of darkness where the only light came from banked coals and the faint shine of stars on slow water. He learned to listen past the regular creak of cooling timbers and the small noises of a settling camp. Coyotes called from the high ground. Branches snapped when deer or elk moved through the understory. Sometimes there was a sound that did not fit the patterns, a faint scrape on stone or a pause in the way the night moved. On those nights he lay with a rifle within easy reach, eyes open, waiting to decide whether the noise marked an animal, a curious scout, or men with a plan to test how much he would fight for his wood. Steamboats moving against the current brought money and trouble in equal measure. When a tall side-wheeler appeared around a bend, blowing its whistle in short bursts, every man in the camp came awake and ready. They had to roll cords down to the landing, keep the stacks steady while sweating crews passed lengths of wood from hand to hand, and settle on a price before the captain's patience ran out. The boilers on a medium boat could swallow enough wood in a single day to strip a long reach of river clean. The payments came in coin and sometimes in whiskey, and both drew attention. Steamboat crews drank and boasted when they had time to spare. Fights flared when short tempers met strong liquor. Johnson held his own in those sudden confrontations with the same direct, heavy fists he had used on the farm and on deck, avoiding knives unless someone else drew one first. Word spread that he was not a man to shove aside while reaching for a drink or a coin. Along the river, native families had used cottonwood for generations as fuel, shelter, and shade. Now, as steamboat traffic thickened and cordwood piles rose, they watched the trees disappear from favorite camping spots and hunting grounds. Meetings between woodhawks and local bands did not always begin with weapons, but they rarely carried warmth for long. Johnson saw men trade coffee, flour, and simple tools for fresh meat or hides. He also saw arguments break out when the price offered in lead or alcohol offended the visitors, or when woodcutters took more than the land could easily spare. At some camps, a rider would appear on a bluff, sit motionless in the saddle, and then turn away again without approaching. Those silent watchers told the men on the river that the cutting and stacking did not go unnoticed. Johnson's life during those years narrowed to a few basic points. He cut wood, he hunted, and he stayed ready for sudden violence. He walked the ridges above camp in every season, searching for game and learning the feel of the land that stretched away from the river. In warm months, the banks swarmed with insects that crawled into clothes and bit any exposed skin. In cold weather, the wind found every gap in a man's coat and pushed straight through to bone. Spring brought floods that turned the Missouri into a rolling mass of debris. Logs that had not been dragged far enough upslope washed out and vanished. Winter locked the water under sheets of ice and trapped camps between frozen banks and silent channels. Through all of it, he grew broader across the shoulders and thicker in the chest. Men who met him in later years remembered a figure well above average height and weight, packed with hard strength rather than softness. That build grew in these seasons of constant labor. He learned to make use of every animal he brought down. Childhood experience killing and dressing hogs translated easily to elk, deer, and buffalo. He could bring a carcass down to quarters with quick, efficient cuts, hang meat where the cold air would preserve it, and stretch hides for later trade. A man in his position could not waste anything. He salted what he could, smoked strips over low coals, and mixed scraps into stews thick enough to keep a body working through long days. Bones became broth and tools. Sinew became thread for mending gear. Each act of butchering and preparation was part of a simple equation. Energy taken from the land turned into more work, and more work meant greater control over his own survival. That stretch of the upper Missouri carried more than wood and cargo. It also carried news. Trappers coming down from remote valleys brought word of beaver streams drying up and of new trading posts where whiskey flowed freely. Soldiers heading upriver talked in blunt phrases about skirmishes with Sioux, Cheyenne, and others along the plains. Sometimes Crow or Blackfeet visitors told their own stories of raids, counters, and shifting alliances. Johnson listened without offering much in return. He had no interest in speaking names that could tie him to a past on a naval roll. The tales he heard marked the northern plains in his mind as a place where a single man could vanish into high country, and where every group watched every other with suspicion. That tension, combined with the harsh beauty of the land itself, drew him north and west. Over time, the pulse of work closer to St. Louis felt cramped. There were too many men watching the same stretch of bank, too many rival camps cutting the same patches of timber, and too many officers and clerks from the army and freight companies moving through with questions that might reach places he did not want opened. Johnson shifted his base steadily upriver toward country that lay between the established forts and the far northern posts. The bluffs rose higher there, rock outcrops broke the horizon. Cottonwood stands grew thinner but still yielded enough to keep a woodhawk in business if he worked hard. Isolation increased, but that suited a man who already accepted that he lived outside the reach of ordinary rules. Past the confluence with the Yellowstone, the river carved through long stretches of broken ground that later generations would call the Missouri Breaks. Steamboats still forced their way along that route during the open season, but they came less frequently. A man who set up a camp there might go weeks without seeing a chimney or hearing a whistle. Johnson cut wood anyway, stacked it where a pilot could spot it, and survived on hunting and careful rationing. Out on the high benches above the river, he walked through grass that moved in steady waves under the wind, watched distant herds of buffalo darken the low ground, and learned to notice any shape that did not fit those patterns. Plains grizzlies, wolves, and armed riders all moved with their own rhythms. To live safely among them required constant attention rather than fear. When winter closed over that northern stretch of river, it did not do it gently. Ice piled in jagged plates along the banks. Snow filled coulees and masked drop-offs. Men in flimsy camps found out which of their habits made the difference between waking to another day and freezing in their blankets. Johnson built his shelters with a practical eye, banking walls with earth, sealing gaps with moss and hide, and stacking wood where drifting snow could not bury it. He kept his rifle clean, his knife sharp, and his powder dry in horn or metal container. The discipline that had once belonged to naval routines now shaped his own survival rules. There were no officers to enforce them, only cold and hunger. As the seasons turned and he grew more familiar with the routes between river and mountains, he began to follow trading paths that led toward the raw interior of what would become Montana and Wyoming. Names like Fort Union, Fort Benton, and Fort Bridger passed through the camps, marking places where goods changed hands and where rough men drank as hard as they worked. At some of those outposts, Johnson took temporary employment as a hunter, supplying meat to company stores or military detachments. His skill with rifle and knife earned him a place at more than one fire. He still avoided deep ties. Once a contract ended, or the snow melted, he moved on, choosing the next patch of country that promised game, trade, and distance from the world that had owned him in uniform. In those years on the rivers and trails, he met members of many different tribes in brief, tense encounters or guarded trade sessions. Flathead, Shoshone, Crow, Blackfeet, and others moved through the same corridors of rivers and passes he now traveled. Some nodded or traded a few items while keeping weapons close at hand. Others approached camp in wary groups, right hands visible, ready to turn a visit into an attack if insult or fear shifted the balance. Johnson memorized their clothing, hairstyles, and markings, learning who tended to approach with open hands and who spun stories of raids and captured stock. That knowledge sank into him the way knowledge of tides had once lived in the bones of sailors. It was not a matter of curiosity. It was a matter of knowing who might become an ally, who might tolerate his presence for a short time, and who might decide that killing a lone woodhawk or hunter would bring honor. By the time he pushed beyond the familiar circles of the Missouri landings and into the approaches of the high country that fed the Yellowstone and other northern rivers, Johnson had become a man who belonged more to the West than to any other place. His speech carried traces of New Jersey and of words picked up on ships and in camps, but his habits fit the harsh territories he now moved through. He slept light, rose quickly, and carried his tools and weapons as natural extensions of his own body. The next stage of his life waited in those mountains and valleys, in the meeting with a woman from a tribe that had lived there long before steamboats and woodhawks, and in the chain of violence that would follow when that brief peace ended. 1847. Snowmelt ran in narrow streams down from the high ridges when Johnson first rode into the valley where the Flathead camp stood for the season. Lodge poles and hides formed a loose ring along a bend in the water, with horses grazing on the short new grass beyond. Smoke from cooking fires flattened under a low sky and drifted toward the timber. He came in slow, leading his animal with one hand, rifle held across the saddle with the other, stopping far enough out that no one could accuse him of pushing straight into their space. Men and women stepped clear of the lodges to look him over, measuring a stranger who carried the smell of wood smoke, blood, and distance. He had met people from many tribes along the Missouri bends and in scattered camps, but the Flathead here watched him with a calm that differed from the sharp, guarded looks of bands that had already crossed him on trading trips. A few men approached, their weapons visible but not raised. They spoke in words he did not understand, then shifted into the trade tongue that had grown up along the trails. Johnson answered with his limited phrases, offering names of men at distant posts who could vouch that he brought hides and meat, not trouble. He unpacked a bundle slowly, unwrapping cloth to reveal steel traps, powder, lead, and small tools that drew interest. The meeting settled into the slow, formal exchanges that decided whether a trapper could camp near a village without inviting arrows in his back. Over the next days, he kept his own fire apart from their lodges, close enough that the camp could see every move, but far enough that no one felt crowded. He hunted from first light, bringing back meat that he shared, and he worked on his gear in full view, letting people watch him mend moccasins or oil a rifle. Children crept closer, staring at the long barrel and at the heavy knife on his belt. Older men watched how he moved among them, whether he turned his back carelessly or kept glancing over his shoulder. Johnson understood those tests and passed them by, staying steady, never flinching, never acting as if he owned the ground. One woman in the camp stood out in his mind from the first week. She carried herself with the assurance of someone used to being heard, though she spoke softly. Her clothing showed careful beadwork and sewing, work that had taken patience and skill rather than quick decoration. When she walked between lodges with water or gathered wood, older women watched her with approval instead of criticism. Men from visiting bands noticed her and let their eyes follow her, but they did so with caution, aware that she belonged to people who would defend her place. Her given name in her own language did not come easily to his tongue, but a few riders told him that the meaning was close to swan. Johnson and the woman whose name translated as swan crossed paths in practical ways before anything more passed between them. She brought meat to the fire where he worked, set it down without show, and walked away. When he helped skin an elk near the camp, she stepped in to take the hide and began to scrape it with quick, strong strokes. He saw how her hands moved without hesitation, how she took on hard work without complaint. Later he saw her calm a frightened horse, speaking in a low tone and letting the animal smell her hand until it settled. None of it was dramatic, but each small act carried weight. In a world where survival rested on steady labor, her value was obvious. Talk of marriage did not come from him directly at first. In Flathead custom, elders and family held the right to speak before younger people. The idea built gradually, shaped by quiet conversations between older men and women in the camp, and the white hunter who had shown himself willing to share his kills and his tools. They weighed what he could offer: a strong arm, skill with weapons, experience beyond their valleys, and a willingness to work. They also judged the risk. A white husband might bring trading advantages, but he might also carry enemies from other bands or from army posts. For Johnson, the decision cut in a different way. He knew that taking a wife here meant accepting responsibility in a place that was not his by birth and planting his life more firmly in country that already held its own obligations and grudges. The agreement, when reached, did not rely on signatures or paper. Gifts moved from his hands to hers and to her family. Blankets, tools, a good knife, powder and lead for rifles. In return, he received not only her presence at his fire, but recognition from the camp that he now held a role bound to theirs. Swan came to his shelter without ceremony that matched church weddings back east. But every eye in the camp marked the shift. From that point on, people referred to her as his wife when they spoke in the trade tongue, and her place at his side carried the weight of that word. He and Swan did not stay long in the exact spot where they had met. The needs of hunting and trapping pushed them toward ground that could support their work through all seasons. Johnson chose a sheltered draw at the edge of timber in the high country east of the main Flathead homelands, near routes that traders and hunters already used between the Yellowstone and Musselshell waters. There he raised a sturdier cabin than the temporary lean-tos he had used along riverbanks. The walls came from squared logs fitted tightly together. A low roof shed snow and rain. Inside, a packed earth floor and a small stone hearth provided enough comfort to carry them through severe weather. Swan took the raw frame of that cabin and turned it into a livable shelter. She hung dried meat from poles, stacked roots and berries in woven containers against the wall, and smoothed sleeping places with furs. She adjusted the doorway so wind would not cut straight through in winter. Outside, she helped him stack firewood in careful rows that would last more than one storm. When they moved through the nearby timber or along the stream, she picked plants that she recognized for medicine or food, showing him which roots eased stomach pain and which leaves helped close a cut. Johnson, who had spent his earlier years thinking mostly of meat and hides, began to see how much she added to his chances of staying alive in a place that took small mistakes and turned them into graves. In that period, Swan became pregnant. It showed first in the way she tired earlier in the day and in the way older women in visiting parties watched her with a different kind of attention. As the months passed, she moved more carefully, but she did not stop working. She mended his shirts, straightened his gear, and kept the cabin ordered so that he could lay his hand on any tool in darkness without fumbling. When he left at dawn to check traps or stalk elk in the higher timber, she stood in the doorway with a blanket around her shoulders, one hand resting over the child she carried. It was a simple sight, but it pressed into his mind more strongly than any landmark. For the first time since leaving New Jersey, he had a place and people that felt like more than a camp between jobs. The country around them never turned safe simply because he felt settled. Johnson knew that crow hunting parties and war bands moved through the same mountains and valleys. He had seen their sign on earlier trips, narrow, pointed moccasin prints different from Flathead footwear. particular ways of tying horses, distinctive feather and paint patterns left on discarded items. Stories in both white and native camps described Crow raids on rivals, on smaller groups, and on isolated cabins. Some tales spoke of families cut down for their horses, food, or for insults that no outsider fully understood. Johnson kept those stories in mind whenever he scanned the ridges while walking back toward the cabin. One winter, as the cold deepened and the snowpack grew heavier, traders passing through urged Johnson to join a run to more distant bands with a load of whiskey and goods. The trip promised substantial returns in hides and horses, but it also meant leaving Swan alone during some of the hardest weeks of the year. He weighed the choice with her, laying out the supplies he could leave and the time he expected to be gone. She listened, glanced around the cabin stocked with meat, firewood, and tools, then nodded. She understood the pull of trade as clearly as he did. A man who refused every chance to improve his holdings might keep his pride and lose everything else. In the end, he saddled his horse, checked his rifle and knife, and prepared to ride with the small party that had gathered. On the morning he left, the snow underfoot squeaked with the dry sound that comes when cold grips it hard. Swan stood in the doorway again, blanket tight, her belly larger now, her expression calm, but intent. He stepped close, put his hand over hers at the curve of her body, and looked around at the cabin, the wood piles and the smoke that drifted from the chimney. The view fixed itself in his head in exact detail. The pattern of logs, the way the roof sagged slightly on one side, the tracks leading away from the door toward the corral. He said little because words would not stretch far enough to cover the list of dangers that waited in every direction. Then he turned and rode out behind the others, each hoof fall carrying him farther from the one place that had started to feel like his own ground. The trading run took him over ridges and through valleys where the snow lay in variable depths, crusted in some spots, loose in others. Nights passed in rough shelters or with whatever hospitality he could find around other people's fires. Deals were made in low, guarded voices. Whiskey passed from hand to hand, hides changed ownership, and horses were traded or stolen in the dark. In bits and pieces he heard scattered talk of Crow movements that season, of small raids and sightings, but nothing that pointed directly at the valley where Swan waited. He finished the business as quickly as conditions allowed, then turned his horse toward home with a restlessness that left him off his feet and quick to anger if delays appeared. As he neared the stretch of country that he now thought of as theirs, small details began to trouble him. Smoke usually visible from certain ridges did not show. The air smelled wrong, holding an old faint trace of char instead of the usual clean wood smoke from their chimney. Tracks along familiar paths showed groups of horses moving in patterns that did not match flathead hunting parties. At one crossing in a narrow draw, he dismounted and examined prints carefully. The heel shape and toe points belonged to Crow men, not Swan's people. Some were older, pressed into snow that had hardened and settled. Others sat fresh on top. He pushed his horse harder after that, ignoring the risk of a fall on hidden ice. The closer he came to the draw where the cabin stood, the more the wrong smells and signs pressed in. At the last rise before the clearing, he left the animal tied in cover and moved forward on foot with his rifle ready. The cabin, when it came into view, did not send a column of smoke into the cold air. The door hung at an angle, not closed as Swan always left it against drafts. Dark streaks marked the snow near the threshold, frozen and dull. The woodpile lay scattered, logs kicked aside in careless haste. Inside the cabin, disorder replaced the careful arrangement Swan had maintained. Bedding was torn apart, containers overturned, supplies rifled. The chest where he kept powder and lead stood open and mostly emptied. On the packed earth floor, he saw dried pools and sprays that needed no interpretation. Outside, not far from the doorway, he found Swan. Her body lay partly covered by snow that had blown over it. Her clothing was disturbed and stained. Her hair, once neatly braided, had been hacked away. The skin on the top of her head bore the rough edges of a scalping cut. Her belly showed the still swelling of pregnancy, but there was no movement. Johnson knelt beside her and brushed away the snow with both hands. The cold had stiffened her features into a fixed expression, the mouth slightly open, the eyes partly closed. He did not speak. There were no words in English or in the trade tongue that could compress what hit him as he looked at the damage done to the only person who had stood with him in that place. He touched her face, then moved his hand to where the child had rested. The silence around the cabin, broken only by the faint sound of wind through branches and by a horse stamping somewhere in the distance, pressed against him with the weight of a physical blow. When his body could move again, he shifted from grief to examination. He studied every mark in the snow and dirt around the cabin. Moccasin prints showed clear patterns. The narrow toe, the cut of the sole, and the way the heel struck the ground told him that the men who had come here were Crow. Arrow shafts and broken bits of gear left behind matched that reading. Scuff marks showed where someone had dragged sacks and goods toward departing horses. There were no tracks indicating Swan's own people had been present after the attack. The killers had come, taken what they wanted, and ridden off, leaving her body where it fell. He dug her grave in ground that did not want to open. The frost held tight under the surface layer of snow and loose soil. He worked with shovel and pick until his shoulders shook and his breath burned in his chest. When the hole was finally deep enough, he wrapped Swan in the best blankets he had left and lowered her carefully, making sure her body rested straight, not twisted by haste. He covered her face last, then filled the grave with earth and heaped stones on top, both to mark the spot and to discourage animals. No priest stood by, no formal prayer was spoken. Johnson stood over the pile of stones with his hands at his sides and his teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. From that moment, his direction narrowed. Before, his life had moved between hunting, trading, and simple survival. Now it funneled into a single goal. He stripped his gear down to what he could carry at speed. Rifle, knife, powder, lead, flint and steel, some food. Everything else he left. He circled the cabin once more to fix the direction of the departing prince, then stepped out on the line that the killers had taken. The tracks led away from the draw and out toward the broader country where Crow bands moved during that season. He knew that time had already begun to blur the edges of the prince, but he also knew that a group moving with loaded horses could not erase every sign. Following sign became his only task. He walked through daylight and into dusk, pausing only when darkness made it impossible to read the ground. At breaks in the terrain, he climbed to vantage points, scanning for smoke or movement. When he found a discarded piece of gear or the remains of a small fire, he studied it for proof that he was still on the right people. Nights he spent on the ground with no fire, conserving his presence, eating cold meat and hard bread. The cold kept him sharp. Each ache in his muscles felt like a reminder of the body lying under a stone pile behind him. He finally found the group he hunted in a shallow basin sheltered from the wind. Several small fires burned low among trees. Horses stood picketed nearby, their breath rising in visible clouds. Men sat or lay around the fires, their weapons within reach, their gear spread around them. Johnson watched from the edge of the trees, counting heads and noting where each rifle and bow lay. Snow reflected enough light from the fires that he could make out painted shields and other markers that confirmed these were Crow, not strangers who had simply crossed the same ground. He waited until the darkest point of the night, when fatigue would pull hardest at men who believed no enemy knew their position. Then he moved. His first shot came from close range, aimed at a man who sat slightly apart, cleaning something in his hands. The round struck with a solid impact, dropping the man backward in a way that left no doubt. Even as others shouted, Johnson shifted to the side, using a tree trunk for cover while he worked the rifle. The second shot hit another warrior rising from his blanket, catching him before he could reach his weapon. Confusion spread through the camp as men tried to find the source of the fire. He closed the distance quickly after that, knowing that his advantage would vanish if he stayed at range. Abandoning the empty rifle, he went in with his knife. The blade met flesh and fabric in quick, forceful thrusts. Each move aimed to end resistance rather than impress anyone watching. Men grappled with him in the half-light. He felt impacts on his own body, glancing blows from fists or weapons, but his mass and reach carried him through the close press. By the time the noise settled, several bodies lay on the ground around the fires, the snow trampled and stained. One or two figures staggered away into the dark, wounded and weaponless. He let them go. He wanted survivors who would carry stories. Once the immediate fight ended, he set to work with a different purpose. Johnson had heard that Crow beliefs held the liver as a seat of courage, and that damage to that organ in life or in death could affect a man's passage into the next world. Whether every detail of that belief matched reality or not mattered less to him than the fact that Crow men feared the idea. Sending a message through their own fears seemed to him the only language that would reach those who had torn his life apart. He drew his knife again, knelt beside the first man he had shot, and cut through layers of clothing and skin. He worked without ceremony, opening the body enough to reach in and remove the liver. The thing felt heavy and slick in his hands, but he did not focus on texture. He cut off pieces and forced himself to chew and swallow, idly aware of the bitter metallic taste and the churn in his stomach. The act itself mattered more than any sensation. He repeated the process on other bodies, cutting out livers and leaving the torsos open so that anyone who found the scene would understand exactly what had happened. The cold air kept the remains from corrupting quickly. He left the camp as he had found it. Fires burned low, horses milling nervously, and bodies placed where the survivors or searchers would see them first. As he walked away into the dark, he carried no trophies other than the knowledge that he had answered Swan's killing in a way that would reverberate through Crow camps. Word of those deaths traveled faster than he did. Crow survivors from that first encounter reached their people and described not only the attack but the condition of the bodies. Stories of a heavy, bearded white man who moved with the force of a charging animal and who cut out and ate the livers of his victims spread along hunting trails and through winter lodges. Trappers and other native groups heard the accounts at shared fires and carried them farther. Each retelling hardened his image, turning him from a solitary hunter into a figure whose name evoked both fear and anger. The man who had once been another drifter on the rivers now stood in people's minds as a deliberate enemy, a single person who had set himself against an entire tribe. From then on, when Johnson moved through the high country, the air around him seemed to change in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Crow men watched for him along ridgelines. Parties moved with more caution when entering regions he was said to favor. Some came looking for him specifically, driven by their own losses and by the need to answer the acts he had committed. He, in turn, no longer saw Crow bands as part of the shifting, complicated field of tribes and traders. To him, they were the faces tied directly to the burned cabin and the grave he had made with his own hands. Every meeting from that point forward carried that weight and that memory, late 1840s to early 1860s. The first spring after the killings in the basin passed without relief. When the snow thinned and rivers loosened, Johnson moved through the same high country where Crow hunters had once treated him as a distant figure of no consequence. Now every sign of their presence tightened something in his chest. A boot heel in damp soil, a horse dropping fresh near a ford, A single crow feather caught on a sage stem, each detail marked the path of men he no longer viewed as possible trading partners or uneasy neighbors. In his mind, they had taken a place fixed just below the memory of Swan's still body. He did not charge headlong at large groups. Years on rivers and trails had taught him the difference between fury and suicide. Instead, he turned the habits of a hunter toward human prey. He shadowed small parties that moved apart from main camps, counting heads, weighing the number of rifles, noting how quickly they reacted to sudden noise. Once, watching from a low ridge, he saw 3 Crow warriors stop to water their horses at a creek, leaving their bows and rifles leaning against a rock. They laughed at something between them, relaxed, confident in the open land. Johnson stayed where he was, measuring angles and distances, waiting until they remounted and rode on. He could have opened fire then, but the broad daylight and their healthy animals would have given at least one man a chance to escape. He wanted survivors, but he wanted them on his terms, not as armed riders fleeing uphill. His first deliberate strike in that extended campaign came on a cold evening when low clouds hid the stars, and a thin wind moved down from the higher ridges. He had trailed a small group of crow hunters for 2 days, staying just far enough back that his presence did not disturb their horses. They traveled without women or children, carrying only weapons, blankets, and a few bundles of meat. When they camped in a shallow draw, building a modest fire and sitting close around it, he circled in darkness and fixed their location from every side. Then he waited until their voices dropped and their movements slowed. He went in on his stomach, pushing through brush that scraped quietly against his coat. The fire at the center of the camp had burned down to a steady bed of coals that cast a low red light. The men lay on opposite sides of the blaze, wrapped in robes with their weapons within arm's reach. Johnson edged closer until he could smell wood smoke and unwashed bodies. He chose the man whose hand lay farthest from his bow, raised his rifle and fired from a distance that made missing almost impossible. The shot punched through the night, followed by a raw cry and a scramble on the far side of the fire. Before the second man could bring up his weapon, Johnson was already moving, closing the gap with heavy strides and dropping onto him with the weight of a grown man who had cut wood his entire life. The knife work that followed was short and brutal. He drove the blade into places he knew would end resistance quickly, under the ribs into the throat. The third man, who had rolled away from his first blanket and reached for his rifle, managed to fire a wild shot that went wide in the confusion. Johnson crossed the remaining space and knocked the barrel aside with one forearm, then stepped in and finished it with steel and hands. In less than a minute, the only sounds in the draw were his own breathing and the small hiss of sap burning in the coals. Once again, he turned from killing to message. He had already committed himself to the act that had given his revenge its distinct shape. Continuing that pattern now meant anchoring his war in the minds of his enemies in the only way he believed would last. He pulled the bodies nearer the failing fire, opened torsos with hard pushes of his knife, and removed the organs that crow men feared most to see dishonored. He chewed and swallowed pieces of the livers with the same clenched, deliberate disgust he had felt the first time at Swan's killer's camp. It did not grow easier with repetition. The taste remained foul, dense with blood and bile, and his stomach rolled against the effort. But he forced each mouthful down, not for food or satisfaction, but for the certainty that a story told later would include that detail. He left the bodies where they lay, chests split, faces turned toward the sky. At the edge of the draw, he paused just long enough to cut a small, crude sign into the bark of a nearby tree, a mark that meant nothing in any known alphabet but would tell him in later years that this was one of his places. Then he faded back into the broader darkness and walked until the sky began to lighten. He did not build a fire that night, trusting cold more than flame. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by dreams without clear images, only the constant strain of pursuit. As seasons turned, stories of similar scenes began to link together along the Crow trails. Parties returned to villages carrying news of hunters found dead within sight of their camps. Their bodies opened, their livers missing. Survivors described a large white man who appeared suddenly from cover, fired with precision, then charged into close quarters with a long knife. Some said he moved without expression, killing in silence, then cutting and chewing as if performing a duty rather than feeding. Others claimed he shouted Swan's name in a tongue they did not understand, or that his eyes showed a fixed brightness that never changed no matter how many men he faced. The details varied, but one point remained constant. Wherever he struck, he left the same mutilation. Crow elders and warriors gave him names in their own language, terms that conveyed the idea of a man who killed Crow and the particular horror of what he did afterward. Around white fires, trappers and traders simplified those phrases into labels that fit their own taste for blunt nicknames. They already called him Johnson. As word of his acts moved from camp to camp, a second name attached itself, first spoken with a mix of fear and fascination. Men in bunkhouses and whiskey tents began to refer to him as the one who ate livers. Soon, even people who had never seen him, who had never walked the country he haunted, spoke of liver-eating Johnson as if they had known him their whole lives. The man behind the name continued to live as he had lived before Swan's death, but every choice bent back toward the feud. He trapped beaver and hunted game because he needed food and goods, not because he cared about the trade as a craft. When he set his traps along creeks and rivers, he always kept half an eye on ridges where mounted silhouettes might appear. He shifted camps frequently, never staying in one place long enough for word of his presence to capture a Crow war party's full attention. Yet he never truly tried to disappear. His trail passed through places where Crow men were known to ride, as if he invited contact on terms he believed he could control. Other mountain men crossed his path in those years and felt the tension he carried. At a lonely post near the upper rivers, a trapper named Del Guay, who would later tell his own embroidered stories, shared a fire with Johnson on a winter night. Del noted the way Johnson's eyes moved constantly to the door, the way his hand stayed near his rifle even while he ate. When Crow's sign appeared near that camp, Del spoke of moving to a safer valley. Johnson agreed to shift, not out of fear, but to keep the ground of any fight free from too many third parties. Around that same fire, over coarse food and against the crackle of frozen logs, the two men traded accounts of past fights. Del told of close calls on the Powder River. Johnson answered with the bare bones of his own history of killings, stripped of emotion and delivered as if he were reciting a list of weather events. At times, Johnson joined short-term efforts that matched his private war with broader conflicts. When small bands of white freighters or hunters prepared to cross known Crow territory, they sometimes sought out guides with reputations for toughness. The man called Liver-Eating Johnson fit that need. He led wagons along routes with good cover and water, positioned men with rifles at bends and narrow cuts, and insisted on nightly routines that kept animals close and weapons ready. When attacks came, his presence stood out. He did not take command in any formal sense, but the violence he unleashed at the point of impact had a visible effect. Crow riders who expected a panicked response from poorly led emigrants found instead a heavy figure who advanced toward gunfire, closing distance instead of backing away. Each confrontation added another layer to the legend. At a small fort where soldiers and civilian employees huddled behind a log stockade, Johnson arrived with a string of hides. During his stay, a series of thefts around nearby camps raised tensions between the garrison and visiting Crow. One night, A Crow warrior slipped over the wall to take a horse and ended up face to face with the mountain man who had risen to check on a strange sound. The fight that followed left the intruder dead inside the perimeter, throat cut nearly to the spine. In the morning, the officer in charge saw the body, noted the missing liver, and realized what it meant. Men in that fort spoke for months afterward of sharing ground with a man whose personal habits went far beyond ordinary frontier roughness. Not all white observers admired him. Some traders who relied on at least a thin layer of trust with Crow suppliers saw Johnson's actions as bad for business. They resented the way his presence could turn a tense but manageable relationship into a barely contained standoff. In one valley, a trader confronted him directly, saying in clear words that the killings and mutilations did nothing but make matters worse for everyone who needed to move safely through the region. Johnson listened without interrupting, then asked whether the trader had ever found his own wife's body altered beyond recognition by a raiding party. The man had not. The conversation ended there. Crow men in turn responded with patterns shaped by their own customs. They sent larger scouting parties into areas where he had been seen. Young warriors eager to prove themselves volunteered for patrols in his territory. At first, they went out with the intention of finding and killing him as they would any dangerous enemy. But the repeated losses from small encounters began to shift the tone. Older fighters started advising against pursuing him with anything less than overwhelming numbers. The risk of losing more men and of having more bodies returned without their livers weighed heavily. The feud, once a matter of direct retaliation, became intertwined with broader tribal concerns about survival in a landscape already crowded with soldiers, railroad survey crews, and settlers. Johnson's own body carried the marks of those years. Scars crossed his arms, chest, and back, lines from arrows, knives, and close gunfire. His hands grew knotted and thick, fingers stiff from constant work and old injuries. Those who met him near the end of this period described a man with powerful shoulders and a heavy beard, a presence that filled a room or camp circle. When asked directly about the stories, he rarely offered clear confirmation. Sometimes he answered with a short laugh and a shrug as if the talk amused him. Other times he nodded once, in a way that neither confirmed nor denied specific acts but let the reputation stand untouched. The name Liver-Eating Johnson, once a scattered phrase in a few camps, settled in firmly by the time the first full decade of his private war closed. It appeared in rough letters in trading post records, scribbled beside notes on hides and debts. It moved downriver with steamboat crews who passed it along with other tales of frontier extremes. It reached Eastern newspapers as a brief mention in stories about the ferocity of conflicts in territories farther west than most readers could imagine. In Crow lodges, parents used his memory as a cautionary figure when warning boys to stay close or to treat certain trails with respect. By the early 1860s, the feud that had begun in one cabin and one grave had changed shape. It no longer existed solely as a chain of personal acts between one man and scattered Crow parties. It had become part of the larger fabric of violence that defined the northern plains. Settlers moving in under the protection of army forts heard that a single man had waged war for years against an entire tribe and survived. Young cowhands who followed herds up the Bozeman and other routes heard the same accounts and absorbed them as examples of what one person could do in a place without dense laws. In this way, Johnson's long string of killings and mutilations altered not just Crow decisions and trading post politics, but also the imagination of people who would never see the mountains where those early fights took place. By the middle years of the 1850s, Johnson's feud with the Crow had become a fixed current in his life, but it did not consume every waking hour. There were seasons when game, trade, and the pull of money dragged his attention in other directions. One of those directions led him onto ground claimed by the Blackfeet, people who already watched the encroaching traffic of trappers and whiskey peddlers with hard eyes. He moved into that country because it held profit. The valleys north and east of the Great Divide carried good fur and long-standing trade routes. They also held men who would gladly sell a dangerous enemy to his worst rivals if the chance came. He had taken to carrying kegs of high-proof liquor on a string of pack animals when he traveled between Flathead and other camps. Whiskey with a cheap base, stretched and flavored to disguise its bite, drew furs faster than cloth or beads. Johnson knew the damage the liquor left behind. He had seen men stagger through snow, fall into their own fires, and wake shaking after nights they could not remember. He still loaded the kegs and counted the gains. In that he matched many other mountain men who looked at the frontier and saw not a moral landscape but a place where each person decided what price they were willing to pay and to charge. One winter journey began in heavy weather that should have warned him away. The sky sat low and gray. Wind drove powdery snow sideways along ridges. Even the animals moved with reluctance, heads down, tails lashed by ice crystals. Johnson wrapped his coat tight, checked the lashings on his packs, and pushed on. The Flathead he meant to reach had hides waiting and a taste for strong drink. The route he chose cut across territory where Blackfeet parties rode in strength during better weather. He calculated that the cold and the depth of the snow would keep them in their winter camps and leave him to his own business. For several days, nothing contradicted that judgment. He saw only old sign in the drifts, softened and rounded, and the occasional faint column of smoke far off where a small group kept a low fire. Nights he chipped a hollow in the lee of rocks, dug out a patch for the animals, and slept folded in blankets with his rifle near his hands. The cold made everything stiff from leather to fingers, and the shrill sound of the wind masked other noises. Under those conditions, a man's hearing lost some of its edge. The ambush came as he followed a narrow cut where snow lay deep between banks of scrub. The animals trudged in single file, heads bobbing. The walls of the draw blocked his view of the open ground beyond. When he reached a bend, riders dropped from the higher edges in a sudden rush. Blackfoot men, wrapped in robes and armed with rifles and lances, slid down the sides and closed the gap in a single burst. One grabbed his lead horse's head. Another swung a club at Johnson's shoulder, striking hard enough to send a bolt of numbness down his arm. Before he could bring his own rifle to bear, 3 more bodies hit him from the side. The weight drove him into the snow. They pinned him there with practiced force, legs and hands finding leverage. Rawhide thongs bit into his wrists and ankles, pulled tight by men who had done this work before. A blow from the butt of a rifle across the back of his head turned the edges of his vision dark. When he came fully back to himself, he lay face up in the cold, stripped to trousers, boots, and shirt, with his coat, weapons, and gear scattered in a circle under watchful eyes. The Blackfeet spoke to each other in fast, clipped phrases, glancing at him with expressions that held no curiosity, only calculation. They knew who he was. Word of a man who cut out livers traveled farther than he did. Selling him to the Crow would not only bring goods and horses, it would hand their enemies a bound figure who had spent years filling their graveyards. That combination promised more satisfaction than any simple killing on the spot. The Blackfeet hauled him to their camp, a cluster of lodges set in a sheltered basin ringed by trees. Smoke drifted from holes in the tops. Dogs wove between people's legs, barking. Children stood at a distance, staring at the broad-shouldered captive whose name they had heard in warnings. They tied him in one of the lodges, fastening his wrists and ankles with fresh rawhide that tightened as it dried. Leather thongs ran from his bindings to stakes driven into the packed earth. A single guard sat near the door, knife at his belt, rifle and bow within easy reach. The guard's job required patience rather than skill. The man on the ground had a reputation, but he was bound, tired, and far from help. The Blackfeet planned their next move with the calm of people who believed they held complete control. Someone would ride to the Crow and offer a trade. Johnson would go east not as a roaming killer but as merchandise. Lying there, Johnson tested every knot in silence. Years of hauling, tying, and repairing gear told him exactly how rawhide behaved in cold lodge air. It tightened at first, biting into skin. Then if the body beneath it flexed and strained in time with breath, fibers might give a fraction. He worked his wrists. Ligaments complained. Blood flow slowed, then surged back with numb tingles. The guard glanced over once or twice, saw only a bound man shifting uncomfortably, and returned his attention to idler tasks, poking at the small central fire and straightening gear. At some point in the night, when the lodge interior had settled into that thick quiet that follows many hours of wakefulness, Johnson poured every remaining reserve into a single effort. He exhaled fully, tightened muscles, and jerked his arms against the thongs with all the power that years of chopping and hauling wood had built into his back and shoulders. Something in the bindings snapped with a muted crack. The guard turned his head at the sound. That half-second of delayed understanding cost him everything. Johnson rolled onto one side, dragging his now looser hands forward. The nearest object within reach was not a rifle or a knife. It was the guard's own leg. Johnson drove his foot into the man's knee with enough force to bend it sharply. Bone and joint shifted under the impact. The guard fell half-sprawled across the center of the lodge. Before he could shout, Johnson heaved his freed hands up, seized the man's neck and jaw, and slammed his head down against the packed ground. The second blow left the body limp. With the guard unconscious or dead, Johnson took the knife from his belt and sawed quickly through the remaining leather. Blood rushed back into fingers and toes, bringing sharp pain. He ignored it. He stripped the guard of clothing, pulling on what he could to shield himself from the cold beyond the lodge. He paused long enough to cut the man's scalp in a rough circle and rip it free. Another mark that would speak when others found the scene. Then he slipped out under the lodge cover, moving low, and threaded his way past sleeping shapes and banked fires. After a few dozen paces, he reached the tree line, then the deeper dark farther out. No one shouted behind him. Snow lay deep between the trees. He moved at an angle, choosing ground that made pursuit difficult. He knew the Blackfeet would come at first light, following his tracks with the same skill he had used for years. Staying ahead of them required more than speed. It required tricks. Shortly after dawn, he found a rocky stretch where wind had scoured the ground clear. There he changed direction sharply, walking along stone, then dropping into a narrow cut that led toward lower ground and heavier cover. Behind him, Blackfeet trackers hit the edge of the bare patch and spread out to pick up the trail. Each moment they spent sorting that puzzle gave him more distance. Food was a different problem. The Blackfeet had taken his supplies, and the camp he had been tied in had not held anything he could steal without risk. The winterland offered little in the way of quick meals. A few bitter berries clung to stems, dried and hardly worth chewing. Small game stayed holed up. His own body, already worn down by days of travel and hours of captivity, began to demand fuel. Hunger opened an option that most men would not consider. Johnson, who had already eaten pieces of human liver at other battle sites, reached back to the guard he had killed in the lodge in the only way still open to him. At a point where he judged the distance sufficient and pursuers temporarily confused, he stopped in a patch of thick timber and used the knife to cut flesh from the guard's leg, which he had carried as part of his escape load, wrapped in cloth. The meat was dense and streaked with fat. Under other circumstances, he would have gagged at even holding it near his mouth. Here, in the dead cold with no other supplies, he sliced strips, held them close to a small, well-hidden fire until surface moisture seared off, and chewed with slow, steady determination. Each bite turned his stomach, yet each swallow sent strength back into his limbs. Once he had eaten enough to move, he buried what he could not use immediately and scattered the covering so animals would find it, further muddying any scent trail. After days measured only by light and dark, by aches and the constant twitch of nerves listening for pursuing riders, he reached a familiar stretch of country near the holdings of Del Guay. The other trapper had set his winter camp near good water and timber, and his dugout shelter offered more warmth than any snow hollow. Johnson staggered into that camp, lined face gaunter than Del had ever seen, clothes torn and blackened, carrying more scars and stories than he had held the last time they shared a fire. He said little of the details at first, only that Blackfeet had caught him, that he had killed his guard, and that he had come back. In a later season, Johnson and Del set their traps and stacked their hides on a set of benches east of the divide, not far from routes used by Blackfeet bands. They built a snug cabin of squared logs for the winter, chinked the gaps, set a stove inside, and dug a concealed tunnel from a back corner that led out to a brush-covered exit. The tunnel started as nothing more than a precaution, a way to slip away in case of fire or a sudden rush by hostile men. Both trappers had seen enough raids to know that many cabins became death boxes once attackers reached the walls. Blackfeet riders did find the cabin that winter. A party came in with weapons ready and horses blowing steam. Instead of simply firing into the structure, they saw its stout walls and decided it would serve better as a temporary prison. Johnson and Del found themselves disarmed and confined inside, with warriors ringing the place and watching every visible opening. The Blackfeet planned to hold them until a larger group could decide on ransom, trade, or execution. In the meantime, the captives still had hands free to cook. Among the supplies in the cabin sat a tin of strychnine crystals, a poison commonly used by trappers to kill wolves and other animals that raided meat caches. The crystals had no smell that would warn unwary users when mixed into food or bait, and only a bitter trace of taste once diluted. As Johnson and Del worked over the flour and lard, forming dough into biscuits under watchful eyes, the two men exchanged glances that carried a single clear idea. Giving their captors poisoned food would be as ruthless as anything Johnson had done on the open hills, but it would also tilt the balance inside this closed circle of logs. They broke open the tin, mixed a measure of the crystals into part of the dough, and formed a batch of biscuits with careful, even motions. The heat of the stove browned the tops, sending a smell through the cabin that drew comments from the guards outside. When the Blackfeet took the pan and sat down to eat, they believed they were enjoying the labor of men who had no choice. The biscuits went down fast, washed with coffee and laughter. Johnson and Del watched through cracks in the door, calm on the surface, counting chews. The poison worked its way through bodies with grim efficiency. Cramps hit first, folding men over, then came vomiting, spasms, and the inability to stand. Shouts rose in the camp, some full of pain, others thick with panic. A few tried to reach horses, only to collapse in the snow. The ring of attention around the cabin shattered. In that chaos, Johnson and Del slipped into their tunnel, crawling on hands and knees through the close earth until they reached the hidden exit beyond the main cluster of men and animals. They emerged into cold air, scanned the scene, and moved off through timber, leaving behind a camp where groans and curses drifted into the sky. That act, added to Johnson's long line of killings and mutilations, broadened his list of enemies. Blackfeet who lost family to the poisoned biscuits did not forget the sting. They told and retold the story of the two trappers who had smiled while mixing dough and death together. The tale shared space with accounts of his earlier escape and with descriptions of Crow men found opened and shamed. Among the tribes, Johnson's name and presence now stood for more than direct combat. They represented a willingness to use any tool, blade, bullet, or chemical to break those he considered foes. White frontiersmen heard the biscuit story through Del and others who repeated it at forts and trading posts. Some laughed at the ingenuity. Others, even among hardened men, winced at the thought of poison used that way. The line between accepted brutality and something that sat one step deeper in the shadows shifted with every recounting. Yet the net effect on Johnson's image was clear. To many listeners, both native and white, he moved fully into the category of a man whose choices sat far past any ordinary scale. Someone whose presence on a frontier already crowded with killers raised the level of fear even higher. In the spring of 1864, Johnson stood again in a city that smelled of coal smoke, sweat, and river mud. This time in St. Louis instead of the eastern ports he had known as a young sailor. The streets teemed with soldiers in blue, wagons loaded with barrels and crates, and men in civilian clothes looking for any way to turn the national war into personal advantage. Recruitment tables crowded the edges of drill fields. Flags snapped in the wind. Drums echoed between brick buildings. The Civil War, which had begun as distant news in remote camps, now pressed in on every side. For years he had lived by his own rules, answering only to the needs of survival and to the cold ledger of his private feud. Yet the conflict that split the country also opened channels that suited a man like him. The Union needed fighters on the western fringe of the war, men who could ride long distances, shoot straight, and endure harsh territory infested with bushwhackers and raiding parties. Officers spoke of guerrillas in Missouri and Kansas who ambushed small columns, burned out settlements, and vanished into woods and ravines before regular troops could catch them. The government wanted volunteers who understood rough country and did not flinch at close killing. Johnson walked past infantry camps with rows of white tents and lines of recruits fumbling with rifles. He passed artillery parks where guns stood in ordered lines. What drew his eye was a group of mounted men drilling on a field beyond, their horses moving in tight turns under shouted commands. The banners and paperwork named them units of Colorado men, Western troops raised in territories he knew. Among them, officers had orders to form and fill companies of a cavalry regiment that would operate across Missouri and the surrounding regions. The designation that settled eventually on the rolls was 2nd Colorado Cavalry, and within that regiment, Company H would carry his name. He stepped up to the enlistment station without flinching at the sight of uniforms. Years earlier, he had deserted the Navy rather than submit to punishment for striking an officer. That decision would have followed another man through any federal recruiting office. Here, under a different name and with records scattered across distant ship logs, it did not surface. The clerk who asked questions saw a tall, thick-chested plainsman with weathered skin and powerful hands, willing to sign for service and swear an oath. Johnson gave his age, his chosen name, and his willingness to fight. The clerk wrote quickly, pleased to add a man who did not need coaxing. When he pulled on the blue jacket and trousers, the fabric felt strange on a body used to buckskin and coarse wool. The weight of an issued carbine and revolver differed from the long rifles he had carried for years. Yet the rhythm of drill failed to intimidate him. He had already endured harsher routines on a warship. The difference lay in where and how this outfit would fight. The 2nd Colorado Cavalry was not destined for the great set-piece battles of the Eastern Theater. Its work would take place along river crossings, in wooded ravines, and on small farms where Confederate guerrillas and raiders struck in fast, brutal attacks. Company H drilled near St. Louis and at frontier posts until the officers judged the men ready to move. Johnson's experience with horses showed immediately. He adjusted saddles without guidance, checked cinches with practiced hands, and kept his mount in condition. Younger recruits watched him when they tried to manage nervous animals, copying his steady grip on reins and the firm way he sat the saddle during sudden starts. When the company first rode out on extended patrols, he settled easily into the line, rifle slung where he could reach it quickly and revolver holstered but available. The old mountain habits glued themselves to his new uniform. The tasks assigned to the regiment did not bring glory in the way Eastern newspapers understood the word. Instead, they focused on chasing bands of Confederate guerrillas, raiders, and irregular cavalry who struck isolated outposts, wagon trains, and small towns across Missouri and adjacent territory. The names of bushwhacker leaders carried weight in that region. Some had burned towns, killed unarmed men, and left mutilated bodies along roads as warnings. The Union commanders in the West viewed them as criminals under flimsy military cover. Orders given to the 2nd Colorado Cavalry reflected that view. The men were told to track, engage, and break these groups whenever possible, with no expectation of polite exchanges. Johnson's company rode dusty roads, creek beds, and narrow lanes bordered by hickory and oak. They crossed farm fields where families eyed them from doorways, not always friendly. In many parts of Missouri, neighbor had turned against neighbor over loyalty to Union or Confederacy. A column of blue uniforms might be greeted with water, food, and quiet blessings in one county, then with clenched jaws and hidden rifles in the next. For a man who had already lived through years of tribal feuds and revenge killings, the tension felt familiar, only dressed in different colors. On patrol, he often rode near the front rank, scanning tree lines and ridge crests. The threats in this theater did not come in the form of massed lines across open fields. They came as sudden muzzle flashes from brush, as shots from attic windows, as ambushes at creek crossings where the first horses sank into mud and the last were boxed in by fire. Johnson's reaction to these tactics reflected his years in the mountains. When gunfire snapped from concealment, he did not freeze or duck instinctively. He urged his horse toward cover, dismounted fast, and used whatever earth he could find as a shield, returning fire with deliberate, aimed shots. Younger soldiers noted his calm and tried to match it, some failing, some learning quickly or dying in the attempt. His skills as a marksman earned him a place among men used as sharpshooters and skirmishers. When the regiment needed volunteers to move ahead of the main body, feel out enemy positions, or hold a line against a probing attack, Johnson went with the forward elements. He had fired at game for decades, judging distance by eye, adjusting aim for wind and movement. Now he turned that same measuring instinct on human targets. From fence lines, thickets, and crude breastworks, he picked off exposed riders and footmen who thought a quick dash across an opening would go unpunished. Each pull of the trigger felt simple within the frame of military orders. These men wore gray or fought under irregular banners tied to the Confederacy. Shooting them did not demand any personal justification beyond the war itself. During Price's Missouri expedition in the autumn of 1864, the 2nd Colorado Cavalry moved as part of the forces gathered to check the Confederate advance. Columns of Union troops converged on key points, including the area around Kansas City. The battle that unfolded near Westport threw cavalry and infantry into a harsh contest over fields, roads, and brush-covered ridges. Company H found itself thrown forward repeatedly to stem pushes by enemy cavalry and to press attacks when opportunities opened. Johnson rode into that fighting with the same grim focus he had brought to skirmishes on the plains. Only now the numbers on both sides climbed higher and flags marked positions. He dismounted under fire, knelt in rough lines along stone fences, and fired at men who wore different faces than the Crow and Blackfeet he had battled before, yet who fell in the same way when a bullet struck home. Shells burst nearby, kicking dirt and fragments into the air. Horses screamed when shrapnel cut them down. Orders from officers came in hoarse shouts, sometimes drowned by gunfire. Johnson's world narrowed to aim, recoil, and rapid checks of his surroundings. When enemy riders tried to flank the position, he and others shifted to meet them, firing from closer range and then stepping in with revolvers when horses tangled and men crashed together. The battle ended with the Confederate force in retreat. For Johnson, the memory carried less of triumph and more of a simple tally of men killed and another confirmation that large, organized engagements left the ground covered in broken bodies in the same way as smaller frontier fights. Later that year, he saw action again at Newtonia in southwestern Missouri. There, cavalry on both sides pressed each other across open fields and low rises. Dust hung in the air, mixing with powder smoke to form a haze that stung eyes and throats. Johnson took up positions where officers needed strong shots placed at longer distances, picking out enemy officers and standard bearers when he could see them. Every man dropped disrupted the Confederate formations, easing pressure on the Union line. When the fighting shifted and the regiment advanced, he swung back into the saddle and moved with the others, ready to fire from horseback or dismount as needed. Life between major engagements reverted to the grinding work of patrols, raids, and small actions. Company H escorted supply trains, guarded bridges and depots, and swept countryside for guerrilla bands. Sometimes they found only abandoned campsites and cold fire pits. Other times they rode into sudden close-range firefights in narrow lanes lined with trees and split-rail fences. Johnson's earlier reputation as a mountain killer reached some ears even within the Army. A few men in the regiment had heard stories of a liver-eating plainsman before they ever learned that he now wore the same uniform. They watched him with a mixture of respect and unease, unsure where the line lay between the disciplined soldier and the man whose past acts fell outside any formal code. Under military authority, some habits changed. Johnson did not cut organs from enemies on battlefields where officers and enlisted men moved in structured patterns, and where surgeons, chaplains, and quartermasters walked among the dead. The war already produced enough mutilation by artillery and stray rounds. There was neither space nor need for personal rituals that would have drawn unwanted attention and formal charges. His violence remained, but it now aimed through the sights of standard-issue weapons under orders stamped with the seal of the United States. Even so, the brutality of Western Civil War operations suited aspects of his character. The enemy included not only regular Confederate troops but also guerrilla fighters whose raids on farms, trains, and isolated posts echoed the ambush tactics of tribal warfare and frontier banditry. When Company H ran down a bushwhacker camp and caught the men still half asleep around dying fires, the fight resembled the night strikes he had made on Crow camps. The difference lay in the presence of officers who later wrote reports framing the action as a legitimate blow against unlawful combatants. Johnson's knife and revolver did the same work they had done in earlier years, only now each blow fit into a larger government narrative. The war took its toll on his body. Long rides in rain, heat, and cold reopened old injuries. Nights spent in muddy fields or in crude billets around posts did not offer the restorative solitude of mountain camps. He saw comrades cut down in sudden ambushes or torn apart by shells. Some of the dead had been recruits barely out of boyhood, more used to town life than to the hard travel of cavalry work. Johnson buried his share of them, helping throw dirt on bodies and set rough markers. The deaths did not surprise him. He had lived for decades in a world where life ended without warning. Yet the scale under official banners with lists of names and formal condolence letters added another layer to his understanding of how governments consumed men. When the Confederate threat in Missouri and the surrounding region finally receded, the need for emergency cavalry forces diminished. In 1865, with federal victory settling into place, the 2nd Colorado Cavalry began the process of mustering out. Men gathered in camps, turned in weapons and equipment, and waited for pay and discharge papers. For some, the end of service meant a return to farms, towns, or trades they had left behind. They spoke of wives, children, and businesses waiting. Johnson listened without offering similar plans. The life he had built before enlisting did not feature a fixed home or a settled trade. The Army had been only another intense chapter, not a replacement for the plains. His honorable discharge released him from formal obligation and returned him to the status he understood best, an armed man free to choose his own roads. On paper, the Union now regarded him as a veteran who had served in Company H of the 2nd Colorado Cavalry during a critical period. The same government whose navy he had deserted years earlier now acknowledged his service and let him go without chains or punishment. That shift did not erase the past or smooth the internal scars he carried from both tribal conflicts and civil war. It simply confirmed that the country could use men like him when convenient, and then set them loose again when enough blood had been spilled. When he left the regiment and stepped away from the rows of tents and drill fields, he still moved with the bearing of a man used to danger. The war had not softened him or stripped away his earlier identity. It had refined certain skills and added fresh memories of sanctioned killing to an already heavy weight of private violence. The next stage of his life would not involve marching in formation. It would take him back into the northern territories, where he would turn once more to scouting, hunting, and wearing badges in towns that needed law enforced by men whose names already carried the sound of gunfire. Late 1860s to early 1880s. When the discharge papers sat folded in his pocket and the blue jacket no longer belonged to him, Johnson headed north and west again, toward country where army posts, rail survey lines, and scattered settlements pressed into territories he already knew in detail. The Civil War had ended, but organized killing did not. The army still needed men who understood long stretches of open ground, who could read tracks and weather, and who did not freeze when rifles flared at close range. In that space between official campaigns and private feuds, a veteran mountain man could sell his skills under new terms. He drifted first through familiar river corridors and trading points, checking who had survived the intervening years. Some old faces were gone, buried near posts or lost on trails. Others had traded trapping for freight work or stage driving. A few still lived rough in cabins along creeks, older and thinner but holding the same rifles. The talk in those camps had shifted. Men now spoke of Forts Keogh, Custer, and other new posts raised behind palisades of log and stone. Names of officers had replaced some of the trappers' old leaders. New routes cut through the plains, carved by surveyors and guarded by mounted soldiers. Johnson's first steady work in this era came as a civilian scout attached to army columns. Officers needed eyes that could ride ahead, feel the land, and return with honest, detailed information instead of hopeful guesses. They looked for men whose names carried weight. Among the list of available frontiersmen, the one called Liver-Eating Johnson stood out. Whatever doubts the officers might have held about his taste for mutilation, they knew that he had spent decades in precisely the kind of high, broken country where they now wanted to move troops. As a scout, he rode at the edge of the Army's world rather than inside its tight formations. When General Nelson Miles pushed forces into the northern plains against Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Allied bands in the later 1870s, Johnson served among the mixed group of white and native scouts who fanned out from the main columns. Their tasks were simple to describe and demanding to execute. They checked water sources, found passes, located fresh sign of hostile camps, and reported which way the land itself would help or hinder large bodies of mounted men. The work turned his old solitary habits into parts of a broader machine. A day might begin before dawn with a quiet departure from the main bivouac. A handful of scouts riding into dim light while infantry and cavalry still slept. Johnson and his companions followed faint marks across frosted grass or thin snow, noting whether pony tracks carried shod or bare hooves, whether they moved with the careless pattern of hunting parties or with the tighter discipline of war bands. He felt weather shifts in his bones and glanced at the sky more often than he spoke. When clouds built in ways that promised hard storms, He factored that into his advice. A blizzard could erase every advantage a column believed it held. He saw the brutal corners of those campaigns up close. After Crazy Horse and other leaders drew their people into harsh winter ground and refused to submit easily. Miles and other officers drove their commands against scattered villages in sequences of sudden strikes. Johnson rode in ahead of such moves, pointing out where an enemy camp might hide behind rolls in the terrain and where ravines could funnel a charge or trap it. He watched soldiers attack lodges filled with families, saw women and children running in panicked directions while bullets and shells tore through canvas and hide. The scenes did not soften him. They fit into the same pattern of violence he had known since Swan's death and long before that. The difference lay in scale and in the presence of flagpoles and written orders. During the long pursuit of the Nez Perce in 1877, when Chief Joseph led his people across dangerous distances in an attempt to reach safety, Johnson again served under Miles. Near the campaign's closing stages, when the exhausted Nez Perce camp lay within reach of converging army forces in the Bear Paw country, cavalry, infantry, and scouts formed a tightening ring. Johnson rode in that circle, another hardened face among men who had spent weeks in the saddle. He saw how the trapped Nez Perce dug into shallow rifle pits and how their fighters still returned fire with grim precision despite hunger and cold. When Joseph eventually came into the army's line with the surrender statement that would echo down generations, Johnson stood not far from the officers who accepted it, a witness whose own record of relentless pursuit had met another people's attempt to escape. Between such major pushes, he returned to more mundane duties that still carried risk. Army quartermasters needed wood to feed stoves and for construction at the new posts spread along northern rivers. Johnson knew how to organize cutting crews, where to find stands of timber that would yield enough logs without stripping the land bare in one season, and how to float or haul pieces to fort landings. At places like Fort Keogh and other supply points, he walked the line between contractor and laborer, hiring men who could swing an axe all day and holding them to production numbers that satisfied military demands. The cords of wood stacked near parade grounds and barracks did not appear by accident. They came from days of grueling effort, directed by men like him who understood both the work and the consequences of shortfalls. That role required a shift in how he dealt with others. As a wood supplier, he spent more time settling pay disputes and less time cutting open enemies. When a hired man complained about rations or wages, Johnson answered with direct explanations rather than long speeches. He knew exactly how much money came, in and where it went, and he did not tolerate theft. Once, when he caught a worker trying to slip an extra line of pay into a tally, he laid the man out with a single punch and dismissed him on the spot. The crew saw blood on the snow and learned without further talk that their boss would not be gamed. Scouting and contract work overlapped. Army officers who had watched him deliver wood also hired him to guide small detachments on runs to outlying posts or on missions to locate reported hostile groups. In those smaller expeditions, his old independence reasserted itself. He chose campsites, set watches, and ordered men to move quietly through especially dangerous stretches. Younger soldiers chafed sometimes at taking instructions from a civilian, but any man who ignored Johnson's directions quickly found how thin the shield of rank could be when a column blundered into ground that funneled fire or hid ambushers. The rough edges of his reputation followed him into every fort and settlement. At Fort Hall, a mixed community of military personnel, civilians, and native allies, a wounded scout named Frank Gruard lay near death after running barefoot across punishing country to escape hostile pursuers. When Gruard finally regained awareness, the face he saw above him tending to his needs with unexpected patience belonged to the same frontiersman others called Lever-Eating Johnson. The nursing did not erase the earlier stories of mutilations and poison. It added a new angle. Men talked of how the notorious Crow killer had spent months tending another man in a fur-lined bed, feeding him broth, changing dressings, and forcing him to fight for life instead of letting him slip away. As the 1870s drew on, the northern plains shifted under the weight of new arrival waves. Rail lines advanced up river valleys and across wide stretches of grazing land. Buffalo herds, already damaged by market hunting and army strategies that targeted them as a way to break native resistance, shrank dramatically. Cattle replaced them on many ranges, driven by outfits that saw profit in beef and in land contracts. Tent clusters and crude lumber streets grew into permanent towns along rivers and near station stops. In that changing environment, Johnson's skills remained useful, but the forms of work available shifted yet again. He moved into roles tied more directly to the rough order of frontier settlements. In the early 1880s, he accepted the position of constable in Coulson, a raw community on the Yellowstone River that would eventually give way to Billings. Coulson sat where freight routes, river traffic, and nearby cattle interests converged. Saloons, gambling rooms, and bordellos lined its few streets. Violence came regularly, carried in with whiskey and old grudges. The town needed someone who could intimidate drunks and hard cases without collapsing under their threats. When residents learned that the large man wearing a badge on his shirt was the same one stories painted as having carved livers from Crow warriors and poisoned Blackfeet, they understood that the council had chosen intimidation on purpose. Johnson did not rely on constant gunplay to carry out that job. He had seen enough bodies in earlier decades to know that killing every troublemaker would leave a town empty. Instead, he used his size, his willingness to stand close, and his calm, fixed stare. When a brawl spilled into the street and men reached instinctively for knives or pistols, he stepped between them with deliberate movements, one hand ready to knock a weapon aside, the other holding his own revolver low and steady. His voice, when he spoke, carried the flat certainty of someone who had already decided how far he was willing to go. In most cases, that alone cooled the hottest tempers. Where it did not, a fist across a jaw or a quick, controlled blow with a baton ended matters before shots rang. Yet there were nights when blood still flowed under lamplight. Coulson's rough establishments drew transient characters who did not know or did not care who enforced the law. In one case, a group of trail hands rode into town after months on the range, pockets full of pay and minds full of grievances. By midnight, chairs and bottles flew in one saloon, and a woman who worked the room screamed as a man jerked her roughly by the arm. Johnson went through the swinging doors without flourish, took in the scene in one sweep, and moved straight to the man whose violence had crossed the line. The cowhand turned, shouted for him to mind his own business, and grabbed for a revolver. Johnson closed the distance before the muzzle cleared leather, slammed the arm upward, and drove his forehead into the other man's face. Bone crunched. Blood sprayed across the bar. When the trail hand staggered back, Johnson disarmed him and marched him into the cold street, dropping him in a heap before hauling him to the crude lockup. The rest of the room sobered quickly. The badge did not erase old habits of caution. Even within town limits, Johnson sat with his back to walls, scanned every door as it opened, and kept his weapons maintained. He walked the streets after dark with measured steps, listening for sounds that did not fit the usual pattern of laughter, piano noise, and raised voices. Coulson may have been a settlement under territorial law, but to him it still felt like another camp where death could step from any alley. Each arrest and each confrontation layered current duties over decades of mountain and military experience. Alongside his formal law work, he continued to take on side jobs that used his other skills. He hauled timber, guided small parties into hunting country that still held game, and advised ranchers on routes that avoided known flashpoints with native groups. His reputation gave weight to his recommendations. When he told a freight outfit that a particular canyon offered good water but also easy ambush positions, they listened. The scars visible on his hands and face and the stories attached to his name underlined his point without extra argument. By the end of the period that drew him from Civil War service into scouting and then into law enforcement, the man who had once lived in an isolated cabin with his flathead wife now stood firmly inside the network of forts, towns, and ranches that defined the New West. Rail schedules, court sessions, and telegraph messages now crisscrossed ground that had once held only game trails and lodge circles. Johnson adapted without softening. He wore army coats and badges when it suited his work, then shed them for buckskins on hunts. The private war that had given him his most notorious name no longer drove every decision, but the relentless capacity for violence he had demonstrated in that feud still lay just beneath the surface, ready to break out if anyone in his new sphere pushed far enough. 1888 to 1895. Snow drove down the valley of Bear Creek when John Johnston set the wall logs of his cabin into place near the new coal camp that called itself Red Lodge. The timber stood dark against drifts that reached almost to his waist. The sound of axes and saws from other cabins carried through the cold air, mixed with the clank of tools from the coal workings at Rocky Fork. Johnston moved slowly but with steady strength, his shoulders thick inside a worn army coat, his beard streaked with white. Every scar on his hands had come from years when this land still lay open and wild. And he felt the difference in the way the valley sounded now, with rail lines and wagon roads closing in on ground where he had once ridden freely. The coal town grew fast. Miners from Wales, Scandinavia, Italy, and other parts of the United States crowded together along muddy streets lined with hastily built false front stores. Saloons glowed yellow in the early winter dark. The Rocky Fork mines pulled in men who wanted wages, not trap lines, and they brought quarrels, drinking, and violence that matched any frontier boom camp. The new citizens needed a man who could stand in the doorway of any saloon and end a fight with his presence. When the question of a town marshal came up, names passed along the plank sidewalks, and every voice that mattered kept circling back to the large, quiet trapper who had built his cabin down by Bear Creek. He accepted the badge in his usual blunt way. At a gathering in the early evening, inside a meeting room above a store, the men who had pushed for his name watched him pin the star to his coat. Someone mentioned that there were younger men who might run faster. Johnston answered that he had never relied on running and did not plan to start then. His face hardly changed, but the room understood the warning. Every story that followed him into Red Lodge, every tale from the Muscle Shell, the Yellowstone, the Powder River country, seemed to stand behind that plain remark. Once he wore the star, the rhythm of Red Lodge shifted. On payday nights when the coal company released wages and the saloons filled, he walked Allen Street with a slow, deliberate pace. His boots hit the planks with the same pressure he had once used on snowshoes crossing high passes. Men who had already taken in too much whiskey lowered their voices when they saw him. Anyone who failed to notice did not stay ignorant long. He did not waste words. A hand on a shoulder, a rough push toward the door, or a single order in a steady baritone usually put a drunk outside before trouble turned serious. Those who tried to swing fists learned what it meant to be hit by the same arms that had hauled heavy beaver packs and buffalo quarters for decades. He still preferred to sleep with the mountains in reach. Even as town marshal, he kept his trapline and hunting routes. At first light on many mornings, he left Red Lodge with his rifle over one shoulder and a sled behind his horse, climbing toward the Absarokas. The new barbed wire fences and ranch houses bothered him more than the cold. He had ridden those draws and ridges when no wire cut the range, and when every watercourse might hide enemies. Now property lines stretched across ground where, years earlier, he had followed tracks with every sense awake. The cold wind that came down off the peak still carried the same dry bite, but he knew the country had changed permanently. On the trap line, he moved without company. He checked sets along frozen creeks, reset steel jaws, and lifted out mink, fox, or the occasional wolf that had pushed through the snow. His hands worked with automatic skill, skinning, stretching hides on frames, and stacking pelts in his sled before daylight faded. Wolves sometimes shadowed his horse at the edge of sight. They kept their distance, and he let them follow. At camp, he boiled coffee, fried meat, and ate in silence, as he had done in trappers' camps when every other cabin lay weeks away. The only new sounds were the distant whistles of locomotives from the growing coal town behind him. When he came back into Red Lodge after days on the line, coal dust floated in the air and settled on snowbanks along the streets. The saloon smelled of spilled beer and tobacco. Men inside those rooms regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Many of them had grown up hearing the name Liver-Eating Johnson spoken around winter stoves, always paired with stories of crow scalps and missing livers. Now the man from those stories leaned on their bar and ordered a drink without raising his voice. Some nights when the crowd grew more relaxed, a miner would ask direct questions concerning his past. He rarely gave long answers, yet he never denied who he had been. When pressed, he described the winter marches, the ambushes, and the close fights in a flat, careful tone. He explained how a man moved in snow so deep that every step threatened to break a leg, how he read sign in the faintest depressions on a wind-scoured slope, how he closed with an enemy at arm's length. When someone asked whether he had truly cut into the bodies of dead Crow warriors, he did not soften his reply. He had done what was needed, he said, to frighten enemies who would not stop. That was all. The words carried more force than any boast. The room usually went still until he shifted the subject or stepped out into the street again. The younger men of Red Lodge, boys barely tall enough to see over the bar, gathered around his boots whenever they found him in a forgiving mood. The story they remembered longest came from a winter evening when a traveling show came through town. Tickets cost more than most local children could spare. The show hall had a big back window that looked onto a narrow alley. A group of boys dragged empty beer barrels under the sill and climbed up, hoping to watch from outside. Johnston walked into the alley, saw them, stacked on the barrels, and hauled them down by the backs of their trousers. They expected the jail. Instead, he marched them around to the front entrance, wrapped his long coat around them so they remained hidden at his sides, and walked straight past the ticket taker. Inside, he sat them in the dark and returned to stand at the back wall while the performance ran. To those children, he became something more complicated than the distant killer they had heard about from their fathers. He was a lawman who would pull them away from trouble with one hand and then bend the rules with the other so they could see the show. His size still scared them. His stories, when he chose to share them in simple language, kept their imaginations filled with images of frozen rivers, circling war parties, and sudden confrontations where men who hesitated died quickly. They knew that the man who had once cut out livers now lived in a cabin at the edge of their new town, and they felt safer whenever they saw his bulk in the doorway of a saloon after dark. Not everyone in Red Lodge understood the details of his past, but they all recognized that the older world of open trails ran through him. Neighbors helped him with wood when storms hit, and he repaid them by keeping the night streets calm. In private conversations with town leaders, he made plain that he would not tolerate knife fights, pistol play, or harassment of women inside the limits. Men who tested that rule woke up bruised, disarmed, and humiliated if they woke up in town at all. Word spread fast along the coal camps and the wagon routes that Red Lodge had a marshal whose nickname came from a long campaign of personal vengeance and visible mutilation. The legend that wrapped around him did not stay inside Carbon County. Newspapers in Montana and Wyoming traded items concerning his presence in Red Lodge. Some articles cast him as a last remnant of the fur trade, an aging figure who had survived when nearly every other mountain man had died violently. Others printed snatches of verse praising his loyalty to friends and ruthlessness toward enemies. Editors knew that readers from St. Louis to Chicago had an appetite for stories that combined the organized violence of modern war with the personal ferocity of the older frontier. Johnston fit that demand without effort. His past supplied more material than any writer could use in one column. Because of those accounts, travelers began detouring through Red Lodge in the hope of seeing him. A few men who worked with traveling shows and exhibitions brought proposals. Wild West promoters understood that crowds paid to stare at people whose names carried terror. They urged him to sign contracts that would place him on a stage beside trick riders, marksmen, and other performers who turned their lives into set pieces for paying audiences. Johnston listened, considered the small print, and refused. He told them he did not ride for public amusement, and he had no interest in repeating battles for applause. The promoters left town annoyed, and he returned to his usual rounds. Even as his name reached distant cities, lines tightened around the land that had once let him vanish without a trace. Railroads and barbed wire caused more change to his world than any enemy tribe. Tracks cut through valleys where he had once guided army columns. Fences blocked water sources that had served as vital stopping points during his years on the Vendetta Trail, and later as a scout. Sitting in his cabin, he read newspapers that carried notices concerning new towns, new mining booms, and the last formal surrenders of native leaders. The violent struggle that had shaped most of his life had given way to legal deeds and survey lines. Those shifts did not erase the fear he had drilled into enemies decades earlier. Crow families who came through the region knew the stories as well as anyone. By that time, however, he no longer carried active hatred. Earlier, he had made peace with Crow leaders, and their scouts had ridden with him under Army command. Word of that reconciliation filtered through Red Lodge. Locals who had once spoken of an endless blood feud began to understand that even a man with his record could move from personal revenge toward a different kind of coexistence. The knowledge did not erase what he had done, but it showed that the man behind the blood-soaked reputation could change course once he judged the debt for his murdered wife paid. In the end, the coal town learned to live with an old killer as its protector. Children grew into adults with clear memories of his heavy footsteps on the boardwalk and his quiet interference whenever tempers burned too hot. Miners who survived rough years under dangerous work carried stories of nights when the marshal's intervention kept a quarrel from ending with a corpse on the floor. When they repeated those stories to new arrivals, they always added the older accounts from the Muscle Shell, the Yellowstone, and the Crow Country. In their minds, the night watchman of Red Lodge and the man who had once cut livers from slain enemies remained the same person. And that combination gave the little coal town a measure of safety at the very edge of a closing frontier. November 24, 1898 was the day a Montana newspaper told its readers that the man known as Liver-Eating Johnson was still alive, old but unbroken, in the coal town of Red Lodge. The Butte paper called him a relic of earlier days and turned his nickname into a punchline. Yet every line reminded people that this was the same John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston whose name had once traveled along wagon roads and army posts with a taste of fear. In Red Lodge itself, he did not need an introduction. When that issue reached town in a stack of week-old newsprint, men in work-stained coats carried it into saloons and stores and glanced toward the heavy-shouldered veteran who still walked their streets with a slow but deliberate gait. By then, his years as town marshal lay behind him, although the badge still rested in a drawer in his small frame house. The worst of his law work had passed to younger men, but people still came to him first when trouble smoldered. His beard had gone white and his hair had thinned, yet his eyes remained clear and direct. Winter in the high country settled into bones that had been broken, into ribs that had taken shock from falls and fights, and into a stomach that had known hard meat and alkali water for decades. When north wind came off the Beartooth and Absaroka ranges and drove snow through Main Street, he cinched his coat tight and walked anyway. Boots thudding on boardwalks, he had once patrolled with a rifle over one arm and a whiskey bottle under the other. Red Lodge had changed around him in the 10 years since he first hung his coat on a peg there. More plank houses had gone up along the dusty grid of streets. False front stores had fresh glass windows. Coal wagons rolled out of the valley in steady lines, and a rail spur carried cars loaded with fuel toward distant smelters. Children who had been babies when he arrived now raced bareheaded past him on errands or to school, knowing only that the big old man with the scarred hands had once kept bad men from using their town as a hunting ground. He watched that bustle with a mixed steadiness and unease. Every new fence, every tidy yard, marked how far the land had moved from the open era when a man could sleep under spruce branches and wake without another soul in sight. Pain followed him through those years like a quiet companion. Old bullet paths tugged when he bent to lift a coal scuttle. His right knee, twisted by a fall when he was a younger mountain man, refused to straighten fully after long evenings by the stove. Cold air in his lungs set off a cough that brought up flecks of dark phlegm. He ignored most of it in the way of men who had survived far worse, but people close to him noticed changes that he did not mention. He sat more often on the bench outside the livery, hands folded over the head of a cane he rarely admitted he needed. When drunks from the camp stumbled into town and tried to raise a ruckus, it was another deputy who stepped in first, though the sight of Johnson's broad shoulders rising from his seat still had the power to quiet a room. The bitterness that had once driven him to hunt enemies without mercy no longer ruled his every step, yet it did not vanish. Men who came to his table in those Red Lodge winters sometimes steered talk toward the older days, toward the story behind that grim name. He had little patience for people who wanted only laughs from a grisly tale. When the talk was serious, when the listener had dirt under his nails or powder on his clothes, Johnson would describe parts of what he had done in calm, flat tones, never romantic and never apologizing. He talked of trails where bodies lay face down in snow, of fights where he opened a man's belly with a knife and did not look away from the ruin. The men who heard him went home sober and quiet, carrying the knowledge that such things had been done within a lifetime by a man who still walked among them. The year that paper story ran, the town saw more of his weakness than his strength. Nights grew longer, and the cold months cut deeper than before. He woke from sleep with stabbing pain in his middle and a sour taste in his mouth that food could not dispel. An ache settled under his ribs and stayed there, a tight knot that made him shift in his chair and press a hand against his abdomen. Neighbors who passed his house after dark saw that the lamplight burned later than it once had. Where he had once rolled into bed and slept like a man used to the open ground, now he lay awake and listened to wind rattle at the house and to the creak of his own breathing. Doctors in that time did not have much to offer a man with a battered body and failing insides. The local physician listened to his chest, rapped knuckles against a stomach wall that tensed beneath the touch, and spoke in quiet tones about rest and softer work. Johnson listened without expression, but the meaning sank in. The years as a hunter, as a soldier, as a lawman had ground his frame down as surely as frost and sun erode a ridge. His modest Civil War pension and a little help from friends kept him from true want. Yet that money did not change the fact that he could no longer split logs or walk all day behind a sled. Each winter's end left him thinner and more stooped. The talk of a soldier's home in California reached him first as a rumor and then as a concrete suggestion. Younger men and town leaders who respected the old fighter and understood his pride approached the subject carefully. They told him of the Pacific branch of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers beside Santa Monica, a place where worn-out Union men could have a bed, doctor care, hot meals, and company from others who had marched and fought. They reminded him that he had earned that right when he put on a blue uniform during the war, and that many men took that option in their last years. Johnson resisted the idea at first. To his thinking, a mountain man should die in his own country with knife and rifle close to hand. Yet each week that passed made simple chores feel heavier, and he knew that sickness would not spare him because he had once been hard and ruthless. In the end, he allowed the forms to be filled out. His name, written with a hand that had steadied rifles on countless targets, went into the applications as John J. Johnston, veteran of Company H, 2nd Colorado Cavalry. Details of his age, his service, and his ailments were listed in ink on lines that stood in place of all the trails he had walked. Men in Red Lodge helped assemble proof, including his discharge papers and statements from those who could vouch that the stooped old lawman had once been a mounted soldier. When word came back that the home would receive him, he agreed to go. There was no celebration. Friends shook his hand outside the depot, and several rough-voiced miners clapped his shoulder and called him by the only nickname they had ever used to his face. He boarded the train with a canvas bag, a worn coat, and a hat that had seen storms, birds, and bullets. The journey toward California took him away from the high ridges that had formed the backdrop of his adulthood. Snowfields gave way to gentler valleys and then to lands where winter did not grip towns with the same ferocity. He sat in a railroad coach filled with other travelers, hands folded on the head of his cane, watching scenery slide past the window. Fenced fields, orchards, and growing cities rolled by in a blur. He had once followed buffalo across untouched plains, and now he peered out at planted rows and telegraph lines that cut across the sky in strict angles. No one in the car knew that the old soldier with the battered face had once taken vengeance on a scale that frightened tribes and whites alike. He had become a single veteran among many, moving quietly toward a place that existed solely to gather such men at the end of their working strength. When he arrived at the Pacific Branch west of Los Angeles in late December 1899, the first impression was of buildings and ordered grounds rather than raw land. The home spread across rolling terrain, its main structures fronted by porches and flanked by rows of trees that officials had planted to soften the bare soil. Long barracks housed lines of iron beds. A chapel rose with simple wooden lines. Paths ran between mess hall, wards, and drill space. The air felt different from Montana air, with sea fog mingling with city smoke and the scent of eucalyptus. Instead of a few cabins or a scattered camp, hundreds of men in dark uniforms moved across the grounds, some on crutches or with empty sleeves pinned to tunics, all of them bound together by wars that lay decades behind them. Admission to the home stripped men of much that had marked their individuality on the frontier. Johnson received a uniform that matched every other former soldier there and a bed in a long room. He answered roll call, obeyed regulations, and lined up for meals like the rest. The food did not resemble camp meat eaten by firelight or fresh elk liver taken from a kill. It came in tin dishes and followed a regular pattern, with stews, boiled meats, bread, and coffee served on a fixed schedule. Bugle calls marked morning and night. There was no whiskey bottle within easy reach of his bunk and no excuse for vanishing into the hills. Even so, the veterans found ways to keep their own character alive, through little gestures and the way they talked when officers were not close enough to listen. Some of the residents had fought along the Missouri or in western districts where his name had already achieved fame. Others had only read of him in newspaper items or dime accounts that lingered near truth in some parts and wandered far from it in others. They drifted toward him as men in any institution drift toward a figure who carries stories the way others carry scars. On shaded benches or in corners of the ward, they asked direct questions. Did you really do those things to the crow? Did you really take organs from fallen enemies and chew them in the presence of survivors? He did not smile when he answered. In a low voice, he confirmed that he had taken vengeance in ways that left no doubt in his enemies' minds about who had killed their brothers. He spoke of knife work that ended fights so completely that there were no second chances and no prisoners. He did not dress those actions up as glory. He described them as work he had set himself to do after a wrong that would never be undone. The staff at the home cared less about his past notoriety than about his growing frailty. Age and a life of harsh exposures had left his body vulnerable. As the weeks went by, the steady ache in his belly sharpened into something angrier. He felt it when he rose from bed, when he sat down after walking the grounds, and when he tried to sleep on his narrow mattress. Eating brought no comfort. The food that the kitchen served slid down into a gut that rebelled. Waves of cramping pain broke across his middle, sometimes bad enough to make his palm slam into the edge of the bunk as he grit his teeth. The color left his face, leaving skin that had once been wind-burned, now gray and drawn. By late December, the medical staff moved him from the barracks into the hospital building. There, nurses and doctors tracked his pulse and temperature in ledgers, while he lay on a bed that had rails instead of a trunk at the foot. Peritonitis, the doctor wrote, inflammation deep inside the abdomen that few medicines of the day could halt. The word itself would have meant little to a man whose life had turned on practical realities rather than Latin terms, yet the sensations it described were plain enough. His abdomen swelled and grew tender. Fever burned across him and left his sheets damp with sweat. Sometimes he muttered harsh words in his sleep, not from nightmares, but from the simple torment of nerves reacting to their own destruction. The Pacific Branch Hospital stood not far from the scatter of white stones that marked the veterans' cemetery. From his bed he could not see those markers, but he could smell cut grass when groundskeepers worked and hear the slow beat of a drum when funerals passed. The sounds folded into his last days along with the quieter noises of that institution. The scrape of chairs, the low talk of orderlies, the cry of gulls that drifted inland on certain mornings. Men who visited his bedside, fellow veterans who had listened to his harsher stories in healthier days, found him reduced in scale but not in presence. His voice weakened, yet it did not waver when he spoke. He asked for no priest and no special ceremony. What he had done in his life stood where it stood, in the memories of enemies, allies, and the country that had grown over the trails he once walked. On Sunday, January 21, 1900, the fight ended for him. The night before had brought long intervals of restless half-sleep, his breath shallow and irregular, his eyes moving behind closed lids but not opening often. Toward morning he lay still, hands resting on the blanket rather than clenched around it. A nurse checked his pulse and found it faint and uneven. When it finally stopped, it did so without theatrical struggle. The staff recorded the time and cause, noting his name, his unit, and the fact that he had died within the walls of the national home rather than on some distant trail. There were no family members gathered at the bed. His witnesses were hospital workers and a few fellow residents who had chosen to sit with him near the end. The home handled his burial with the same firm routine it applied to every veteran who died there. They placed his body in a plain coffin, draped it with a flag, and arranged a small honor detail. Outside, a wagon carried the casket the short distance to the cemetery grounds that had been laid out for men like him. Rows of headstones already stood there in ordered lines, each marking the end of a different story that had once unfolded across battlefields, ships, camps, and homes. Johnson's coffin joined that solemn landscape. A short service, the crack of rifles firing a salute, and the folding of a flag marked the final public acts. Then soil, shoveled by steady hands, covered the box. The man whose path had run from New Jersey farms to mountain camps, from savage private revenge to federal service and town law work, lay now in level ground within reach of the Pacific surf rather than beneath the high sky of the Rockies. In Red Lodge and other places where his name had carried weight, word of his death took time to travel. When it came, it closed a living chapter but did not end the talk. Men around Western stoves repeated stories that stretched and twisted facts, but always returned to the same core, that a man who had lost a husband's peace in a brutal act had answered it with ruthless action over many years. On that January day in California, however, the reality was simpler. An old soldier whose hands had been instruments of both frontier violence and frontier order had died in a bed shared in kind with thousands of other worn-out veterans. The ground closed over him, but the axe that had made his name would not be so easily covered. The first earth over his coffin at the Pacific Branch Cemetery settled in January 1900. The grave lay in a neat row on ground that had once been open country west of Los Angeles, and now belonged to the government in ordered plots. A plain white stone marked the spot, inscribed with his soldier name and unit instead of the words that had followed him across the plains. Men who walked among those markers saw John Johnson, Com H, 2nd Colorado Cavalry, and moved on. The cemetery staff knew him as one file in a ledger. No sign on that narrow rectangle of dirt told visitors that the body belonged to a man whose private war once reached into crow lodges and trading post talk from the Yellowstone to the Missouri. For decades, the stone stood in that place while Southern California surged outward. Streetcars, then motor cars, then freeways wound past the old soldiers' home grounds. Houses and storefronts climbed over hills that had once heard only the crack of rifles at practice and the shuffle of boots at morning roll. The veterans' cemetery stayed as a rectangle of measured silence within the new sprawl. Families came there on Memorial Day to leave flags or flowers on graves without knowing that one of the markers belonged to a former trapper and lawman who had carried the nickname Liver Eating. His name did not disappear entirely. Old men in Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas kept retelling stories of the Crow Killer when winter nights stretched long. A few regional histories and newspaper columns mentioned him as one more brutal figure from the fur trade era. The tales moved unevenly, some placing him in wrong years, others confusing him with different fighters, but all circling the image of a heavily built frontiersman who had once hunted enemies with a length and fury that set him apart even from other Indian fighters. Then, in the late 1950s, a book pulled those scattered accounts into a single spine and poured fresh fuel onto his legend. In 1958, the first edition of Crow Killer, the saga of liver-eating Johnson, went into print. Raymond Thorpe, drawing on earlier collector's notes and on stories told by men who claimed to have known Johnson or his companions, shaped a narrative that pushed every violent episode to the front. Robert Bunker helped bring that material into a structured form. The book laid out the mountain man's alleged vendetta as a sequence of fiercely described killings, each capped by the same ritual of cutting and eating liver. It retold the Blackfeet capture and escape, the poisoned biscuits, and the long list of ambushes in language that left no space for hesitation. Readers who had never heard the name before now met a figure presented as a single-minded engine of revenge, moving through snow and blood without pity. Crow Killer did not sit on official archive shelves alone. It circulated among Western readers who already favored tales of Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, and it reached film producers who were always looking for stories that combined landscape, violence, and lone men standing against odds. The book made clear that the frontier had produced a man who had taken vengeance into his own hands and carried it for years. Every page reinforced that image. Although historians later pointed out how much of the text relied on oral lore instead of contemporary documents, the immediate effect in the 1950s and 1960s was simple. The name Liver-Eating Johnson moved from backcountry memory into mainstream Western myth. Another piece fell into place when novelist Vardis Fisher published Mountain Man in 1965. Fisher crafted a fictionalized account of a solitary trapper whose experiences echoed pieces of Johnson's life and of other mountain men. His protagonist endured deep winter hardship, violent clashes with native bands, and the loss of a family in a remote cabin. The book did not name Johnson, yet it drew on the same cluster of stories concerning slaughtered wives and long, lonely campaigns of payback. Together with Crow Killer, it gave filmmakers a layered set of images to strip and combine into a more compact story. They could shoot in color on western slopes. In 1972, theaters lit up with Jeremiah Johnson, Sidney Pollack's film starring Robert Redford. On screens across the country, a bearded, weary veteran of the Mexican War took to the high country as a trapper. Viewers watched him learn skills from older hands, marry a woman far from towns, lose his family to a raid, and then slide into a long cycle of violent clashes with a native tribe. The movie drew directly from Crow Killer and Mountain Man, yet it stepped away from Johnson's most notorious acts. There were fights, scalps taken, and running battles in snow, but no scene showed the hero cutting open a corpse and chewing liver in front of horrified onlookers. The film softened the cannibalism into suggestion and kept the focus on endurance, solitude, and stoic rage. Despite that softening, the picture welded Johnson's name to a broader audience than any previous book had reached. City dwellers, students, and rural families alike watched Redford ride through Utah locations that stood in for the Rockies and came away with one strong impression. Somewhere in the real past, there had been a man whose wife had been murdered, who had then gone into the mountains and turned himself into a figure that even hardened warriors feared. The film's success pushed reporters and casual readers back toward the underlying story. Articles in newspapers and magazines revisited the real Johnson, repeating details from Crow Killer, mixing them with local lore from New Jersey and Montana, and presenting him both as a near savage and as a symbol of grim independence. In 1973, that renewed attention reached a classroom in Southern California. Try Robinson, a young teacher working with a 7th grade American literature class in Lancaster under a gifted program, brought Johnson's story into a room full of restless 12-year-olds. He told them how the mountain man had lived and died, how he had been buried not in the high country he had walked, but under a standard stone in a veteran cemetery swallowed by city streets. The students listened, pictured the coal camps and cabins, and then imagined his bones lying in a neat row of markers beside the hum of traffic. Their reaction hardened into anger. To them it felt wrong that a man whose life had been spent under cold stars and on raw ridges now lay under trimmed grass beside an urban freeway. Instead of letting that feeling die at the bell, Robinson turned it into a project. The class wrote letters to officials, to the Veterans Administration, to elected representatives, and to people in Wyoming who could claim a connection to Johnson's last mountain years. They gathered documentation on his service record and his burial at Sawtell. They worked through rules that govern the movement of remains from a national cemetery. Each response they received forced them to refine their arguments, to prove that they were not chasing a whim but making a considered case that this particular veteran should be moved. Against expectation, their file grew thick with replies. People who had the power to say yes or no took notice of a group of determined children asking that a long-dead frontiersman be taken back toward the slopes he had once patrolled. Support in Wyoming centered on Cody, a town that had already built Old Trail Town as a frontier museum on its western edge. Cabins from earlier settlements, relics, and markers stood there to show visitors how the region had looked during Johnson's working life. Bob Edgar, who had assembled many of those structures, saw that bringing the mountain man's remains to that ground would tie legend and landscape together in a single place. Residents of Red Lodge, who knew that Johnson had served as their marshal and had been part of their coal town's rough birth, pushed back. They wanted any reburial to happen in the soil he had walked in his last working years. For a time, the argument moved between Montana Voices, Wyoming boosters, federal agencies, and the distant class of 7th graders who had started the whole effort. The final decision landed in Cody's favor. In early 1974, permission came to lift Johnson's remains from their California grave and re-enter them at Old Trail Town under new stone. The class in Lancaster had achieved something few adults expected. Bureaucratic language confirmed that 25 students and their teacher were, for this purpose, the dead man's next of kin. When the date for exhumation arrived, a detail opened the grave at the Los Angeles National Cemetery and lifted out the coffin that had rested there since 1900. The original headstone and the remains went into a new transport casket for the long trip toward Wyoming. Rumors of interference from Montana partisans hovered around the plan, so the procession moved under careful watch. Trucks carried the coffin north and east, crossing ground that Johnson himself had never seen. Reporters covered the odd event of a frontier killer's body traveling through the late 20th century on paved highways, escorted by people who knew him only from print and film. When the convoy reached Cody, Old Trail Town stood ready. Flags hung still in high country air. The reburial date, June 8, 1974, fixed itself on local calendars. The ceremony that day tied together nearly every strand of his complicated legacy. Try Robinson and several of the students who had pressed the case stood near the dug grave, watching the coffin come off a truck. Territorial reenactors in buckskins fired salutes. Local dignitaries spoke about mountain men, frontier endurance, and the way stories carry forward past individual lives. Robert Redford, whose face had taken Johnson's name into theaters 2 years earlier, took a place as one of the pallbearers, his hands on the same weight the California gravediggers had first lowered under government orders 74 years earlier. Representatives from the Crow arrived and placed tokens of peace at the site, acknowledging the long arc that had carried a feud into grudging reconciliation and finally into shared ceremony. The new grave in Old Trail Town received more than earth. Johnson's original government stone was set there, joined by a larger marker that called him John Jeremiah Liver-Eating Johnston, and by a bronze figure capturing his stance as a mountain man. Workers poured concrete thickly over the coffin and around the sides, 2 truckloads of hardened barrier that would keep the remains from being disturbed again. The new stone carried a short line that closed the loop on a life spent walking rough country. No more trails. Visitors who stepped up to the grave now saw not just a name and a unit, but a full set of labels that linked him to legend, to film, and to a specific place in the West's tourist map. In the years after that reburial, his story kept growing and changing. Tour buses pulled into the Old Trail Town parking lot, and guides led groups along the boardwalks toward the grave. Children stood there with ice cream wrappers in their hands, while adults took photographs of the statue and the markers. Guides repeated the vendetta accounts in condensed form, speaking of a murdered flathead wife, a long campaign against the Crow, the grotesque habit with livers, and the final move to Cody. They folded in film references, pointing out that the man under the stone had inspired Jeremiah Johnson and that Redford himself had helped carry the coffin. In those short speeches, decades of scholarship and doubt compressed into a simple shape that fit an afternoon visit. At the same time, historians started to strip that shape back down. Researchers such as Nathan Bender and others sifted through pension records, contemporaneous newspaper reports, letters, and early memoirs. They showed that many of the detailed episodes in Crow Killer had no firm basis in documents, and that some grisly incidents came from stories told earlier about different figures then attached to Johnson as his fame grew. Academic articles and careful essays did not soften his image into virtue. They simply put the legend in context. He remained a hard man who had lived through bloody years and had built a fierce reputation. But the precise body counts and set pieces that popular books had pinned to him could not be confirmed. That work did not erase his place in Western imagination, yet it gave serious readers a clearer sense of how myth and fact had fused in his case. By the end of the 20th century, one grave in Wyoming and one set of books and films had fixed John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston in the public mind as one of the most violent individual actors in the Old West. The stories of his liver eating, whether literal truth in every instance or not, shaped how generations pictured the frontier. To them, the 19th century West was not only a landscape of wagon trains and cattle drives, it was also a place where a man whose wife had been murdered could spend years hunting her killers and leave piles of mutilated bodies behind him. Towns that used his image on brochures sold a vision of that past as raw and unforgiving. Writers and filmmakers who followed the path of Crow Killer and Jeremiah Johnson built further roles for solitary wounded men who answered wrongs with personal campaigns instead of courts. The cemetery at Old Trail Town closed the physical distance between that violent record and the present. On late-century evenings, when the sun dropped behind the Absaroka front and shadows stretched across the clustered cabins, visitors often ended their walk at the grave. They read the carved name and the brief epitaph. Some knew the full list of stories, from the vendetta to the biscuits, from the days in Red Lodge to the hospital bed in California. Others knew only the film and the nickname. All saw the same stone and statue, evidence that the Old West had been turned into a place where one man's most brutal acts could be distilled into a single image and presented as part of the region's permanent identity.